There is a country at the far northwestern edge of Europe where the fields do not grow grain the way they should, where the coastlines are so jagged and wind-scoured that trees gave up trying to take hold centuries ago, where the winters arrive early and stay long, and the light in January barely bothers to climb above the hills before retreating again. It is a country that most people, if pressed, would describe with words like remote, rugged, cold. A country of castles and whiskey and sheep and fog rolling off the lochs before dawn. A country that the Romans, who conquered most of Britain, looked at from below Hadrian's wall and decided was not worth the trouble. They built the wall and they stayed south of it, and for centuries most of the rest of the world followed their example, looking towards Scotland from a comfortable distance and admiring it the way you admire a painting that would not suit your house. But there is something in that country that nobody has ever been able to explain, something that predates the castles by thousands of years, that predates the clans and the battles and the whiskey and the tartans by so long that all of Scottish history, as most people know, it amounts to a thin smear of recent time laid over something vastly older. Scotland has more standing stones per square mile than any other country in Europe, not just more than its neighbours, not slightly more. Dramatically, inexplicably, almost absurdly more. When archaeologists began systematic surveys in the 18th and 19th centuries, they found stone circles and stone rows and lone standing stones and complex megalithic monuments packed into the Scottish landscape at a density that made no sense. In a country roughly the size of South Carolina, there are thousands of these structures. Some of them are famous, like the great standing stones at Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, which have been called the Scottish Stonehenge, even though they are older than Stonehenge and structurally more complex and far more strange. Others are not famous at all. They sit in farmers' fields and on windswept hillsides and at the edges of peat bogs, unnamed and unstudied. Boulders the size of cars standing upright in the earth, with no explanation offered and none satisfactory found. Why are they here? That is the question. Why Scotland? Why this particular country? This wind-battered northern edge of the world? This place that seems like exactly the last location on Earth where an ancient civilization would choose to expend enormous quantities of human labor erecting massive stone monuments. The conventional answer, when one is offered at all, is that these structures were ceremonial, that they were built by prehistoric communities who used them to mark the solstices, or the cycles of the moon, or the rhythms of the agricultural year. And that answer is not wrong exactly, but it is so incomplete that it functions almost as a way of not answering. It says what the stones may have been used for while leaving untouched the deeper and stranger question, which is why here, why so many, and what happened to the people who built them so completely that nothing remains of them except the stones themselves. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and something about it catches me every time. The way these videos find people in their beds, in Melbourne and on their sofas, in Edinburgh and in apartments in Seoul at 3 in the morning, all of us at the same moment thinking about the same ancient silence. The stones have been standing longer than most of what we call history. They were already old when the Romans came. They were ancient when the first Scottish kingdoms formed. They have outlasted every explanation offered for them, and they are still there, still waiting, still holding whatever it is they were built to hold. So let us begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of Scotland, and not the beginning of the stones, but the beginning of the question, which is the moment when someone first looked at this landscape and understood that what they were seeing could not be an accident. Stand on the Isle of Lewis on the Outer Hebrides on a clear morning in late June and look west toward the Atlantic. The island is almost treeless, a vast expanse of peat moorland that stretches to the horizon, with only the occasional croft house or standing stone to interrupt the flatness. The wind here is almost always present, sometimes a gentle persistent push off the sea, sometimes something wilder that leans into you and makes walking feel like an argument. The sea is visible from most of the island because the island is narrow enough that you are rarely far from either the eastern shore, facing the Scottish mainland, or the western shore, facing nothing but open ocean until you reach Newfoundland, 3,000 miles away. It is on the western side of this island, near the village of Callanish, that the stones stand. There are 53 of them in the main complex, arranged in a pattern that took archaeologists well into the 20th century to fully understand. The central feature is a circle of 13 standing stones surrounding a single monolith so tall that it is visible from miles away. A finger of Louisian gneiss, pointing at the sky with the confidence of something that has been pointing at the sky for 5,000 years and expects to continue. From this central circle, 4 avenues of stones radiate outward in a rough cross shape, running north, south, east, and west, though not in perfect alignment with the compass, the deviations being intentional rather than accidental, as the builders made adjustments to account for features of the landscape and the sky that mattered more to them than true north. The stones are not enormous by the standards of Stonehenge or Karnak in Brittany or the great temple sites of Malta. They are not stones you would call dramatic if you saw them photographed against other landscapes, but in the context of the Lewis moorland, low and flat and wind-stripped, they have a presence that visitors consistently describe as overwhelming. They are human height, most of them, which means, standing among them, you look them in the eye. You are not dwarfed by them the way you are dwarfed by the stones at Avebury or by the Sarsens at Stonehenge. You stand among them as an equal, and that creates a different kind of uncanny, a different kind of wrong feeling, because stones should not be your equals in height, should not stand in a circle and look at you the way you are looking at them. The Louisian gneiss from which the Callanish stones are cut is among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the earth. It formed approximately 3 billion years ago, more than 2/3 of the way back to the formation of the planet itself. The rock is banded grey and white with occasional veins of pink, and it has a quality in certain lights of looking almost translucent, as though something were lit behind it. When the builders of Callanish selected stones for the monument, they were selecting from a material that was already ancient beyond comprehension, ancient beyond any framework human minds had to understand age, as ancient relative to the builders as the builders are to us multiplied by approximately 1,000. We do not know who built Callanish. We know that the main complex was erected around 2900 to 2600 BCE, which puts it roughly contemporary with the early phases of Stonehenge and the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza. We know that the site was used for ritual or ceremonial purposes over a very long period, that deposits of human bone and pottery were found at the base of the central monolith, suggesting that the dead were interred here, or brought here, or commemorated here in ways we cannot reconstruct with confidence. We know that the site was buried under several feet of peat sometime around 1000 BCE, which preserved it remarkably well, and that the peat was cleared by a local landowner in the 1850s, revealing the stones in something close to their original configuration for the first time in 3,000 years. What we do not know is considerably more interesting than what we do. We do not know the name of the culture that built these stones. They left no writing, no inscriptions, no oral traditions that survived intact through the intervening millennia. The people of Lewis, when the stones were uncovered in the 19th century, had stories about them. Legends of giants turned to stone by a priest when they refused to convert to Christianity. But these stories were clearly inventions of the medieval Christian era, attempts to explain what was already incomprehensible rather than genuine memories of the builders. The actual builders had been so thoroughly erased by time that not even a myth about them survived. We do not know the full extent of what was built at Callanish because the evidence suggests strongly that what stands today is only a portion of a much larger complex of monuments spread across the surrounding landscape. Within a few kilometers of the main site, there are at least 7 other stone circles and settings, a density of megalithic structures so high that the entire area functions less like a collection of individual monuments and more like a single vast ritual landscape spread across the moorland. Some of these secondary sites align with the main complex in ways that appear deliberate. Others align with astronomical events. Still others are positioned in ways that make geometric sense when mapped, but whose purpose if there was a purpose beyond the geometry itself, remains unknown. And we do not know what the builders were responding to. This is perhaps the deepest question. When you build something as labor-intensive and as permanent as a stone circle, you are responding to something. You are answering a need so urgent or a belief so powerful that it justifies months or years of collective labor. The transportation of stones weighing many tons over difficult terrain, the precise calculation of astronomical alignments, the sustained cooperation of a community that probably numbered in the hundreds at most. You do not build Callanish by accident or on a whim. You build it because something compels you to build it. And we have no idea what that something was. The mainstream archaeology of British and Scottish megalithic monuments has made enormous progress in the last 50 years. The development of radiocarbon dating, and later of more sophisticated dating methods, has allowed archaeologists to establish when many of these sites were built with a precision that would have seemed miraculous to their predecessors. Isotope analysis of human bones found at megalithic sites has allowed researchers to determine whether people buried there had grown up, revealing patterns of migration and pilgrimage that were entirely unexpected. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR surveys have revealed buried features at known sites and identified entirely new sites that were invisible on the surface. We know, in short, considerably more than we did. But the more we know, the stranger the picture becomes. Because the picture that is emerging from the accumulation of archaeological evidence in Scotland is not the picture of a simple farming society that built ceremonial monuments as markers of the agricultural seasons and then gradually lost interest as better technologies arrived. The picture that is emerging is considerably darker, considerably more complex, and in at least one important sense, considerably more disturbing. The stones of Scotland were not built by a settled, prosperous, expanding society. Many of them appear to have been built during or immediately following periods of significant stress. Climate deterioration, population decline, the failure of agricultural systems. The stones may not have been celebrations. They may have been desperate measures. To understand why this matters, you need to understand something about the climate of northwestern Europe during the Neolithic period, the era of agriculture and monument building that begins roughly 10,000 years ago and runs to the introduction of bronze, working around 2500 BCE. The climate was not constant during this period. It fluctuated, sometimes dramatically, sometimes in ways that would have been catastrophic for farming communities operating close to the margins of what the land could support. Scotland, in particular, at the northern edge of viable European agriculture, was extremely vulnerable to these fluctuations. A drop of even 1 or 2 degrees in average summer temperature could mean the difference between a harvest that fed a community through winter and a harvest that did not. There was a particular event, a period of climate deterioration around 2200 BCE, that archaeologists now recognize as having had profound effects on human societies across a wide geographic area. This event, sometimes called the 4.2 kiloyear event because it occurred approximately 4,200 years ago, involved a prolonged drought in many parts of the world and a cooling and increased storminess in northwestern Europe. Its effects in Scotland appear to have been severe. Pollen analysis from Scottish peat bogs shows a sharp decline in the pollen of cultivated grains around this period, suggesting that farming communities either failed or retreated southward in large numbers. Archaeological sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries show signs of abandonment, and yet the stone building continued. In some areas, it intensified. Some of the most elaborate Scottish megalithic monuments appear to have been constructed during or immediately after this period of stress, rather than during the periods of relative stability that preceded it, which raises the obvious and uncomfortable question. What were people building monuments for during a time when their agricultural systems were failing and their communities may have been in decline? What need was so urgent that it overrode the need to solve the immediate practical problem of feeding people? One answer, and it is an answer that mainstream archaeology is increasingly willing to consider, even if it is reluctant to state plainly, is that the stones were not separate from the crisis, but a response to it. That when everything that the community depended on began to fail, when the harvest shortened and the winters lengthened and the certainty of spring became less certain, the people did what human beings in extremis have always done. They turned to whatever they believed governed the forces responsible for their suffering. They built things to speak to those forces. They aligned their monuments to the sun and the moon, because the sun and the moon were the visible agents of the climate that was killing them. They made the most permanent things they could make, because permanence was what they were losing. This would explain why Scotland has more standing stones than any other country in Europe. Not because Scotland was the most prosperous or the most populous or the most culturally sophisticated region of prehistoric Europe, but because Scotland was the most vulnerable, because it sat at the edge of the range where agriculture was viable, because the margin between survival and failure was thinnest there, because when the climate turned against farming communities in Britain, it turned hardest against the ones in the north. The stones on this reading are not monuments to success. They are monuments to desperation. They are the largest collection of prayers in stone that the ancient world produced, and they are concentrated in Scotland, because that is where the prayers were most urgently needed. But this interpretation, compelling as it is, does not account for everything. It does not account for the extraordinary precision of the astronomical alignments built into so many Scottish megalithic monuments. It does not account for the evidence of long-distance trade and connection that allowed knowledge and building techniques to spread across vast distances. It does not account for the deeply strange patterns that emerge when you map all of the Scottish standing stones together, patterns that suggest not random or even locally organized building activity, but something that looks disconcertingly like a coordinated program operating at a scale that should have been impossible for Bronze Age communities to manage. Let us look at the astronomical alignments first, because they are the most documented and the most verifiable, and they are also the most disorienting once you begin to understand what they actually tell us. The people who built the megalithic monuments of Scotland knew the sky. This is not a romantic exaggeration or a mystical claim. It is a technical observation, verifiable by any competent astronomer who takes the trouble to calculate the positions of the sun and moon as they would have appeared 5,000 years ago, and then checks those positions against the alignments of the surviving monuments. The alignments are real, they are precise, and in many cases, they are precise in ways that require a knowledge of astronomy that goes considerably beyond what a farming community, with no written language and no sophisticated mathematics, is supposed to have possessed. The Callanish complex on Lewis is the most thoroughly studied of the Scottish megalithic astronomical observatories, if that is what they are, and the most dramatic in its implications. The avenue of stones that runs to the north of the main circle aligns within a fraction of a degree with true north, which is impressive but not unique among megalithic monuments in Britain. More interesting is the alignment of the main circle and its associated avenues with the moon at a specific and extremely unusual point in the lunar cycle, called the major lunar standstill. The moon, like the sun, rises and sets at different points on the horizon at different times. But while the sun traces a relatively simple annual cycle, rising a little further north each day from winter solstice to summer solstice, and then retreating southward again, the moon's cycle is considerably more complex. The moon's rising and setting points vary not only through its monthly cycle, but through an 18.6-year cycle that causes its extreme rising and setting points to shift substantially over time. At the major lunar standstill, which occurs once every 18.6 years, the full moon rises to the south of the east direction and sets at the southernmost point it ever reaches, tracing a low arc across the southern horizon that causes it at certain latitudes to skim the hills and then appear to rest briefly on the horizon before setting, a phenomenon so visually striking that it has been described by observers who have witnessed it as appearing to make the moon sink into the earth itself. At the latitude of Callanish, the major lunar standstill produces an effect that is unique in the British Isles and possibly unique in the world. When the full moon rises at its major standstill, it rises from behind the hills to the southeast of the main circle, passes through the southern avenue of stones, appears to walk the length of the avenue, and then sets behind the hill directly to the south. The effect, when viewed from the northern end of the avenue, is of the moon rising, walking south through the stone avenue, and vanishing into the hill as though returning to the earth. Observers who have witnessed this phenomenon, which last occurred in 2006 and will occur again around 2025, consistently describe it as one of the most extraordinary natural spectacles they have ever seen. And the builders of Callanish designed the entire complex around this spectacle. The alignment is too precise to be accidental. The avenue is too perfectly positioned to be anything other than intentional. Someone, 5,000 years ago, understood the 18.6-year cycle of the moon well enough to build a monument oriented to it. This is where the conventional explanations begin to strain. We are asked to believe that a farming community in the Outer Hebrides, 5,000 years ago, with no writing, no sophisticated mathematics as far as we can determine, no telescopes or instruments of precision, understood the 18.6-year cycle of the lunar standstill. That they tracked this cycle, probably across multiple generations, since you need to observe at least 2 full cycles to be confident you understand the pattern. That they used this understanding to precisely orient a major stone monument, and that they did all of this not because it had any practical agricultural benefit. The moon does not affect when you plant crops, but because the spectacle of the moon walking through the stones and descending into the hill was sufficiently important to justify the enormous labor of building the monument in the first place. None of this is impossible. Human beings are observant. Communities that pass knowledge across generations by oral tradition, rather than written records, can maintain precise astronomical knowledge for very long periods, as demonstrated by Aboriginal Australian communities that preserved accurate accounts of volcanic eruptions and the rising of the seas at the end of the last ice age in oral traditions spanning thousands of years. The builders of Callanish were not stupid. They were not ignorant, but they were operating without the tools that we normally associate with this level of astronomical sophistication, and that absence of tools makes the precision of the alignment deeply puzzling. It becomes more puzzling still when you begin to look at the other Scottish megalithic monuments and their alignments. Callanish is the most celebrated and the most thoroughly documented, but it is not the only Scottish monument with significant astronomical alignments. The Ring of Brodgar on Orkney, a circle of standing stones that was originally constructed with 60 stones, of which only 27 survive, aligns with the midsummer sunset and the midwinter sunrise in ways that appear deliberate. The stones of Stennis, a smaller circle also on Orkney that is among the earliest stone circles in Britain, dated to approximately 3100 BCE, aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. The standing stones at Macri Moor on the Isle of Arran, a complex of 6 stone circles in various states of preservation, include alignments to both the solstices and the equinoxes, and these are only the most documented. Scotland has dozens of sites with claimed astronomical alignments, and while some of these claims are speculative or contested, the core body of well-documented alignments is substantial enough to be taken seriously by astronomers as well as archaeologists. What this pattern of alignments tells us, if the alignments are genuine and deliberate, is that the people who built the Scottish megalithic monuments were engaged in a sustained, coordinated program of sky observation and monument construction over a period of centuries or possibly millennia. They were not building individually and locally, each community erecting its own monument according to its own lights. They were, somehow, participating in a shared project of astronomical documentation, rendered in stone, creating across the Scottish landscape a distributed observatory that recorded in permanent form the most important visible events in the sky above them. And that shared project implies something that is very hard to explain, given what we know, or think we know, about the social organisation of Neolithic Scotland. It implies communication. It implies the transmission of sophisticated astronomical knowledge across considerable distances, between communities that had no written language and no fast means of transport. It implies, in short, a degree of social and intellectual organisation that does not fit the image of scattered farming villages, operating largely in isolation, that textbook accounts of Neolithic Britain tend to project. Something was holding these communities together. Something was coordinating the building program, transmitting the knowledge, ensuring that the monuments were oriented correctly, maintaining the tradition of sky watching through the generations necessary to understand the full lunar cycle. What that something was is one of the questions that the stones have never answered. The conventional answer invokes a priestly or specialist class, a group of experts in astronomical observation and monument building who traveled between communities, transmitted knowledge, and directed the construction of monuments. This is a reasonable hypothesis, and there is some indirect evidence for it in the archaeological record. The isotope analysis of human bones from megalithic burial sites has revealed that some individuals buried at these sites did not grow up locally, that they had spent their early lives in distant regions and traveled to the monument sites later in life. This is consistent with a picture of a mobile specialist class whose members moved between communities, carrying expertise and knowledge with them. But the specialist class hypothesis, even if correct, only pushes the question back a level. Where did the specialists learn their astronomy? How did the tradition of precise astronomical observation begin in a society with no writing, no calculating instruments, no institutional infrastructure for the preservation and transmission of technical knowledge across generations? These questions do not have easy answers, and the existing archaeological evidence does not provide them. What the evidence does provide is a picture of connection, a picture of Scotland in the Neolithic period as part of a web of contact and exchange that extended far beyond its boundaries, a web whose full extent is only beginning to be understood and whose implications remain genuinely shocking to those who stop to think about them carefully. The most compelling evidence for this connection comes not from the stones themselves, but from the pottery found at the sites where stones were erected and the bones of the people buried there. During the Neolithic period in Britain, a distinctive type of pottery called grooved ware was produced and used at monuments across a vast geographic area, from Orkney in the far north of Scotland to the sites of southern England, including the Stonehenge complex. Grooved ware is decorated with geometric patterns incised into the surface of the clay before firing, and its designs are strikingly consistent across this entire geographic range. The same motifs appear in pottery from the Orkney sites and pottery from sites in Wiltshire, more than 1,000 kilometres to the south. This consistency is not the result of independent invention of the same designs in multiple locations. It is the result of contact, of the movement of people or objects, or both, across the full extent of the British Isles. What this means for our understanding of the Scottish standing stones is significant. It means that the communities building these monuments were not isolated. They were connected, part of an interacting network of communities, spread across Britain that shared material culture, artistic traditions, and almost certainly shared beliefs and practices, of which the monument building was one expression. Scotland in the Neolithic period was not a remote backwater. It was, in some respects, a centre of a cultural phenomenon that spread southward. Some of the most significant innovations in megalithic monument building appear to have originated in Scotland and Orkney and diffused southward rather than the other way around. This is a reversal of the conventional expectation, and it matters because it suggests that the question of why Scotland has so many standing stones may have a different kind of answer than the ones usually offered. If Scotland was a centre rather than a periphery, if the monument building tradition was more intense there, not because the people were more desperate, but because they were, in some sense, the originators and the most committed practitioners of a tradition that spread southward to the rest of Britain, then the density of standing stones in Scotland reflects not marginality, but centrality. Scotland had more stones because Scotland was where the tradition was strongest, most deeply rooted, most thoroughly integrated into the fabric of social and spiritual life. And that raises a question even more difficult than the ones we have been asking so far. Why Scotland in particular? Why did this extraordinary tradition of stone monument building arise most powerfully in the far north of Britain, in a landscape that was difficult, cold, frequently storm-swept, marginal for agriculture, and separated from the rest of Europe by miles of open sea? Why not southern England, which had a milder climate and more fertile soil and better connections to the rest of Europe? Why not France, where the great megalithic traditions of Brittany produced monuments of comparable complexity? Why here? The answer, or rather the beginning of an answer, requires going back much further than the Neolithic period. It requires going back to the end of the last ice age, to the moment when the ice sheets that had buried most of Scotland under several kilometres of ice began their retreat, and to the people who moved into the newly revealed landscape in the ice's wake. Scotland was not always an island. This is the first thing to understand about the deep history of the landscape, the thing that changes the picture entirely when you hold it clearly in your mind. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels around the British Isles were dramatically lower than they are today, in some places by more than 100 metres. What is now the North Sea was dry land, a vast low-lying plain that connected Britain to continental Europe, a landscape of rivers and grasslands and marshes that archaeologists called Doggerland after the Dogger Bank. The shallow underwater ridge that is now the most recognisable surviving feature of this drowned world. People lived in Doggerland. They hunted the herds of animals that grazed its plains. They fished its rivers. They built settlements that have long since been swallowed by the sea, settlements of which we know only because occasionally the fishing nets dragging the bottom of the North Sea haul up fragments of antler and worked flint, and once a fragment of human skull. As the ice retreated and the climate warmed, the meltwater raised the seas. Doggerland did not disappear all at once. It was a slow submergence, slow enough that communities living on its margins could track the change over generations, could watch the coastline retreat a little each decade, could remember that their grandparents had described land where now there was water. But it was inexorable. By approximately 6,000 years ago, the submergence was essentially complete. Britain was an island, and Scotland, at the far northwestern end of this newly isolated island, was separated from the rest of the world by hundreds of miles of open Atlantic to the west and by the newly expanded North Sea to the east and south. The people who had inhabited what is now Scotland during the late glacial period were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, communities of mobile foragers who followed the retreating ice northward as the climate warmed and the landscape opened up. These were the first inhabitants of the Scottish landscape, the people who arrived in the wake of the glaciers and found a world that was raw, recently sculpted by ice, full of rivers and lakes and rich in the animals and plants that moved in to colonize newly deglaciated land ahead of the trees. They left traces in the archaeological record that are sparse compared to the traces left by later populations, but significant enough to tell us that Scotland was inhabited by mobile hunter-gatherers for several thousand years before agriculture arrived. We know very little about these people in terms of their beliefs or their social organization. But there is one thing we know about them that turns out to be profoundly important for understanding what came later. They were observers. The evidence for this comes from a site called Warren Field in Aberdeenshire, where archaeologists excavating in 2004 discovered a row of 12 pits that had been dug and refilled repeatedly over a period of several thousand years, beginning around 8000 BCE. The pits formed a curve that corresponded to the arc of the moon through the sky, and their spacing and positioning appeared to encode a system of lunar timekeeping, a way of tracking the month by the moon's phase. This is the oldest known lunar calendar in the world, predating the lunar calendars of Mesopotamia by approximately 5,000 years. The people who dug those pits at Warren Field were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They had no writing, no pottery, no domestic animals, no cultivated crops. They were, in the conventional framework of human prehistory, among the simplest and least technologically sophisticated type of human society that can exist. And yet they were tracking the moon with sufficient precision to build a monument to their observations, a monument they returned to and maintained and modified over thousands of years. They were not primitive people waiting to be civilized. They were sophisticated people whose sophistication expressed itself in ways that were unfamiliar and that we have been slow to recognize. This matters for the Standing Stones because it establishes that the tradition of skywatching and monument building in Scotland did not begin with the arrival of farming. It was already ancient when the Neolithic farmers arrived from the south, bringing with them their domestic animals and their cultivated grains and their new technologies of pottery and polished stone tools. The farmers did not bring the tradition of paying close attention to the sky to Scotland. They arrived to find that tradition already deeply embedded in the landscape and the culture of the people already living there. What happened when the farmers arrived is itself a question that has been the subject of significant debate in recent years. The old model held that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain were either replaced by or rapidly absorbed into the incoming Neolithic farming populations, that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was essentially a demographic event in which a new population moved in and the old ones disappeared. Ancient DNA analysis has complicated this picture considerably. The genetic evidence from Britain suggests that the transition to agriculture was indeed primarily driven by incoming populations from continental Europe, rather than by the adoption of new practices by the existing population. But it also suggests that the transition took longer and was more complicated than the simple replacement model implied, that there was contact and exchange between the Mesolithic and Neolithic populations for several generations before the Neolithic genetic signature came to dominate. During this period of contact and exchange, something important may have happened. The Neolithic farmers, bringing with them their new technologies and their tradition of monument building that had been developing across continental Europe for centuries, encountered a population that had already been watching the sky and building monuments to their observations for thousands of years. The meeting of these two traditions, the deep indigenous tradition of astronomical observation, rooted in the Mesolithic past, and the incoming Neolithic tradition of monument building, may have produced something that neither tradition would have produced alone. It may have produced the extraordinary density and sophistication of Scottish megalithic astronomy. This is a hypothesis rather than an established fact. The evidence for it is indirect and circumstantial, but it fits the pattern of what we find in the archaeological record, rather better than the alternatives. It explains why Scottish megalithic monuments show a level of astronomical sophistication that is not found to the same degree in other parts of Britain. It explains why the stone building tradition in Scotland seems to have been particularly intense and long-lasting, and it accounts for the deepest and strangest fact about the Scottish standing stones, which is that they are not simply monuments. They are knowledge encoded in stone, knowledge that had to come from somewhere, that had to be accumulated over a very long period, and that in Scotland had apparently been accumulating for longer than anywhere else. The knowledge encoded in the stones goes beyond the lunar cycle. It goes beyond the solstices and equinoxes that are most commonly cited in discussions of megalithic astronomy. There is evidence, still contested by some archaeologists, but increasingly supported by careful measurement, that some Scottish megalithic monuments encode knowledge of a more esoteric order, knowledge that speaks of careful observation of planetary movements, of the positions of specific stars at specific times of year, of geometric relationships between monuments spread across the landscape that imply surveying and planning on a scale that should have been impossible. Let us take the example of the stone circles of Orkney, which deserve extended attention, both because they are among the best preserved and most thoroughly studied megalithic monuments in Scotland, and because the archaeology of Orkney has in recent decades produced discoveries that have changed our understanding of the Neolithic period in Britain more fundamentally than anything found elsewhere. Orkney is a group of islands at the very northern tip of Scotland, separated from the Scottish mainland by the turbulent Pentland Firth. The islands are low and wind-scoured, even more treeless than the Outer Hebrides. The peat moorland stretching to the horizon in every direction, with only the occasional hill to provide relief. In terms of agriculture, Orkney is marginal at best. The growing season is short, the soils are thin, the weather is frequently hostile. By most conventional assessments, Orkney should not be important. It should be a peripheral place, a backwater at the edge of the world, where small farming communities eked out a subsistence living far from the centres of power and innovation. The archaeology says something very different. Orkney, in the Neolithic period, was not a backwater. It was, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, something close to the opposite. The concentration of significant, sophisticated megalithic monuments on these small islands is extraordinary. The Ring of Brodgar, with its original 60 stones set in a perfect circle, 340 metres in circumference, is one of the largest stone circles in Britain. The stones of Stennis, smaller, but older, and possibly the earliest stone circle in the British Isles, is technically remarkable in the precision of its construction. The Ness of Brodgar, an extensive complex of monumental buildings discovered in 2003, when a farmer's plough broke through the surface of what had seemed like an ordinary field, has been described by excavating archaeologist Nick Card as the most important Neolithic site in Europe, a claim that still sounds hyperbolic, but that the evidence accumulating from the ongoing excavation is increasingly compelling. The Ness of Brodgar is a complex of large rectangular stone buildings set within a walled enclosure, arranged around open areas in ways that suggest the complex functioned as a center of ceremonial or communal activity rather than as a settlement in the ordinary sense. The buildings are large, the largest comparable in floor area to a substantial medieval hall, and they were decorated with painted geometric designs and carved patterns that represent some of the most sophisticated Neolithic art found in Britain. The site was in use for approximately 1,000 years, from around 3300 to 2300 BCE, and during this period it appears to have been a major centre of some kind, drawing people and animals from across Orkney, and possibly from further afield. The evidence for this drawing in of people and resources comes from the animal bones found at the site. Excavations at the Ness of Brodgar have recovered hundreds of cattle bones, many of them from animals that were not bred locally. Isotope analysis of these bones indicates that they came from animals raised on different soils from Orkney, soils that in many cases correspond to regions of mainland Scotland and possibly further south. This means that animals, probably cattle, were being driven or transported to Orkney from considerable distances for use at the site. This is a logistically demanding undertaking. Moving large numbers of cattle across the Pentland Firth by boat, or alternatively maintaining large herds of cattle on an island that cannot easily support them, requires significant organisational capacity and strong motivation. Something at the Ness of Brodgar was worth this effort. Something there was drawing communities from far away to participate in whatever was happening at the site. This pattern of drawing in resources and people from across a wide geographic area is consistent with the idea that Orkney in the Neolithic period functioned as a kind of ritual centre, a place of pilgrimage or gathering that served communities spread across a much wider region. And if Orkney was a ritual centre, then the knowledge associated with ritual practice, including the astronomical knowledge that allowed the precise orientation of monuments, may have been concentrated there and transmitted from there to communities across Scotland and beyond. The idea of Orkney as a source of cultural innovation in the Neolithic period, rather than a peripheral recipient of it, is supported by other evidence. The grooved ware pottery tradition, which, as we noted earlier, spread across the entire British Isles during the Neolithic period, appears to have originated in Orkney. The earliest known examples of grooved ware come from Orkney, and the stylistic evolution of the tradition is most clearly documented in the Orkney assemblages. If grooved ware originated in Orkney and spread southward, then Orkney was exporting cultural innovation to the rest of Britain, not receiving it. This reversal of the expected direction of cultural flow from centre to periphery is one of the most disorienting things about the archaeology of Neolithic Scotland. We expect culture, technology, and sophistication to flow from warm, rich, well-connected regions toward cold, marginal, remote ones. We expect the centres of innovation to be in the places where life is easiest. The evidence from Neolithic Scotland suggests that in at least one important respect, the opposite was true. The far north, the cold edge, the seemingly marginal zone, was producing and exporting cultural innovations that the more hospitable south was adopting. And this raises a question that very few archaeologists have been willing to address directly, which is why. One answer, and it is an answer that sits uncomfortably at the boundary between archaeology and other disciplines, involves the specific qualities of darkness. Scotland in the Neolithic period was not simply cold, it was also in winter extraordinarily dark. At the latitude of Orkney, the winter solstice brings fewer than 6 hours of daylight. The long winter nights are remarkable for the clarity with which the stars are visible on cloudless nights, and for the frequency with which the northern lights appear. The aurora borealis dancing across the sky in curtains of green and red and white, that in a world without artificial lighting would have been among the most visually overwhelming phenomena that human beings regularly experienced. Communities that spent long winter nights under that sky, nights so dark that the stars and the aurora were the primary sources of light and the primary objects of attention, would naturally have been close and careful observers of the night sky, in ways that communities further south, with shorter nights and more light pollution from fires and settlements, would not have been. The astronomical tradition of Neolithic Scotland may have begun not with sophisticated mathematical reasoning, but with something simpler and more intimate, the accumulated observations of countless winter nights by people who had little else to look at and who noticed things because they had the time and the darkness to notice them. This is a humbler explanation than the ones that posit a priestly elite or a tradition of sophisticated mathematical astronomy, but it may be closer to the truth. The people who first noticed that the full moon at a certain time of year traced a particular arc across the hills above Callanish were not necessarily doing astronomy in any formal sense. They were watching the sky because the sky was what there was to watch, in the way that people who live in deserts become intimate with the wind and people who live on coasts become intimate with the tides. The intimacy came before the formalization. The observations came before the monuments. And by the time the monuments were being built, the tradition of skywatching was so old and so deeply embedded in the culture of the far north that it had become inseparable from what it meant to live there. The stones on this reading are the materialization of an observational tradition that was older than the stones themselves. They are the moment when watching became recording, when the ephemeral motion of light across the sky was frozen into the permanent positioning of stone. And the reason there are so many of them in Scotland, more than anywhere else in Europe, is that the tradition that produced them was older and deeper and more thoroughly integrated into the culture there than anywhere else. When you have been watching the moon for 3,000 years, before you start building monuments, you build a lot of monuments. But the stones themselves are not the only legacy of this tradition. There is another legacy, stranger and less well known, that has only recently begun to attract the attention it deserves. It is the legacy of the people who were not replaced, who were not absorbed, who were not erased by the waves of agricultural migrants and later Bronze Age and Iron Age immigrants that washed over Scotland. The legacy of the people who carried the old knowledge forward, not in stone, but in memory, not in monuments, but in practices that survived, transformed and sometimes hidden through thousands of years of change. Scotland, uniquely among the countries of northwestern Europe, preserved certain archaic cultural practices into the historical period that left traces in written records and oral traditions. The Druids, who appear in Roman accounts of Britain and Gaul as the learned class of Celtic society, the possessors of esoteric knowledge who required 20 years of education and who transmitted their knowledge exclusively in oral form, have often been assumed to be a Celtic invention, a product of the Iron Age Celtic culture that spread across Europe in the last millennium BCE. But there is a growing body of evidence that Druidic practice, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, was not purely Celtic in origin, that it represented a continuation and adaptation of a much older tradition of learned practice that predated the Celtic migrations by thousands of years. The Roman writer Julius Caesar, who had more opportunity than most ancient writers to observe Druidic practice, noted that Druidism appeared to have originated in Britain rather than in Gaul, and that Gauls who wished to pursue the deepest levels of Druidic learning travelled to Britain to complete their education. This suggests that in Caesar's time, somewhere between 60 and 50 BCE, Britain was regarded as the heartland of the Druidic tradition, the place where it was most deeply and authentically practiced. And within Britain, the evidence consistently points to Scotland and Ireland, the most remote and least Romanized parts of the British Isles, as the regions where the oldest layers of the tradition were most intact. What the Druids actually knew and practiced is a question that has been obscured by centuries of romantic myth-making, by 19th century revivals that mixed genuine scholarship with enthusiastic invention, and by the fundamental fact that the Druids themselves wrote nothing down, leaving their tradition to be described only by outsiders, most of whom were hostile and none of whom had direct access to the inner levels of Druidic learning. But certain things are clear from the accounts that survive. The Druids were astronomers. They tracked the movements of celestial bodies with precision, and this astronomical knowledge was central to their practice. They were guardians of oral tradition, maintaining in memorized form vast bodies of knowledge, including historical records, genealogies, legal codes, and mythological narratives. They operated across tribal and political boundaries, traveling freely between communities that might be at war with each other, fulfilling functions that included not only religious ceremony, but also dispute resolution, political mediation, and the maintenance of shared cultural norms. This description fits very well with the picture of the Neolithic tradition of specialist knowledge transmission that we inferred from the archaeological evidence. The Druids may have been, in some meaningful sense, the inheritors and continuers of a tradition that had been operating in Scotland and the wider British Isles for thousands of years before the Celts arrived, a tradition of maintaining and transmitting astronomical and other esoteric knowledge that had originally been associated with the building and use of the megalithic monuments. This is a hypothesis that some archaeologists and historians find interesting and others find far-fetched. The gap in time between the latest megalithic monument building, which mostly ended around 1500 BCE, and the earliest historical references to Druids, which come from the 2nd century BCE, is over 1,000 years, and that is a long time for any tradition to maintain itself in oral form without written support. But traditions have maintained themselves for longer. The Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that preserve accurate accounts of sea level rise and volcanic activity are in some cases more than 10,000 years old, transmitted orally through cultures that had no writing and no institutional support beyond the community itself. If oral tradition can maintain accurate geological and astronomical knowledge for 10,000 years in Australia, it is not inherently implausible that an oral tradition in Scotland could have maintained astronomical knowledge for 1,000 years. What makes it plausible in the Scottish case is the continuity of the landscape itself. The people who built the megalithic monuments were not replaced by the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations who came after them. They were, to varying degrees, absorbed into those populations. The incoming Bronze Age people mixed with the existing Neolithic population, and the Iron Age Celts mixed with both. Each wave of immigration added new genetic and cultural material to the Scottish population, without entirely replacing what was already there. And the oldest and deepest layers of the culture, the layers that reach back to the Mesolithic tradition of sky watching and the Neolithic tradition of monument building, could have survived within this mixed population, carried by families and lineages who remembered themselves as the guardians of the old knowledge, even as the world changed around them. The standing stones themselves may have functioned as anchors for this tradition. As long as the stones stood, and they have stood for thousands of years, they served as physical reminders of the knowledge they encoded. Even when the specific ceremonies that had been performed at the stones were no longer performed, even when the language in which the knowledge had been transmitted changed from whatever pre-Celtic language the Neolithic builders spoke to the Celtic languages, and then to Scots and English, the stones remained. They were there to be read by anyone who had been taught to read them, and teaching someone to read them required transmitting, in some form, the astronomical and geometric knowledge they encoded. This is why the standing stones of Scotland are dark. Not because they were built for dark purposes, not because the people who built them were cruel or violent or motivated by fear in ways that other ancient peoples were not. They are dark because they outlasted everything else. The language the builders spoke is gone. The religion they practiced is gone. The social structures that organized the building projects are gone. The specific ceremonies that took place at the sites are gone. Even the people themselves, in the genetic sense, are not quite gone, but are so thoroughly mixed with later populations that no living Scots can claim to be their direct descendant in any meaningful way. Only the stones remain. and the stones stand over a landscape that has seen everything they have outlasted, and they keep whatever they know to themselves. But the darkness of the stones is not only the darkness of loss. There is another dimension to it that is harder to discuss, because it touches on questions that archaeology, as a discipline, is not well equipped to address. It concerns what the stones were actually doing, in the minds of the people who built them and used them, in relation to the forces they were aligned to track. The sun and the moon are not merely astronomical objects. They are, and have always been, the most powerful forces that human beings can observe with the naked eye. The sun brings warmth and light, drives the cycles of plant growth, determines the agricultural seasons, and sets the terms on which survival is possible at all. The moon controls the tides, provides the only reliable artificial light for nocturnal activity, and tracks the passage of time in a period closely corresponding to the human menstrual cycle. These are not abstract relationships. They are immediate, daily, vital connections between celestial bodies and the conditions of human life. For a community living at the northern margin of European agriculture, where the difference between a good year and a bad year could be the difference between survival and starvation, these connections would have been felt with an intensity that is difficult for people living in modern, food-secure societies to recover imaginatively. The return of the sun after the winter solstice was not a calendrical event. It was a reprieve. The major standstill of the moon was not an astronomical curiosity. It was an event of potentially cosmic significance, a moment when the most powerful celestial body in the night sky did something it did only once every 18.6 years, and what it did was visible, in the most dramatic form possible, only from certain specific locations, including the site at Callanish. The people who built the monuments oriented to these events were not simply recording astronomical data. They were putting themselves in relationship with the forces those events represented. They were building structures that participated in the events, that were moved through by the light of the solstice sunrise or the shadow of the major standstill moon, that were transformed by those events from arrangements of inert stone into something else. What that something else was is the thing that is hardest to say in the language of archaeology, because archaeology deals with material evidence, and the transformation of a stone monument by passing light is not primarily a material phenomenon, but an experiential one. There is a tradition in the study of prehistoric art and architecture of using the concept of liminality, the condition of being at a threshold, to describe the function of monuments like the Scottish standing stones. The liminal is the in-between, the neither here nor there, the moment of transformation between states. Births and deaths and initiations are liminal moments in human life. Thresholds and doorways are liminal spaces. Sunrises and sunsets are liminal times. The moments between night and day, neither one nor the other. The Scottish standing stones aligned to the moments of maximum liminality in the sky, the standstill moments when the celestial bodies are neither rising nor declining, but paused at the extreme of their range, may have been built to harness the particular quality of those moments. What you do with liminality depends on what you believe about it. If you believe, as many ancient peoples did, and as many contemporary peoples still do, that the normal boundaries between the human and the divine, between the living and the dead, between the visible and the invisible, are thinnest at liminal moments, then a monument positioned at the point of maximum cosmic liminality is a monument positioned at the point where access to otherwise inaccessible dimensions of reality is most possible. This is not magic in the pejorative sense that the word often carries in the mouths of rationalists. It is a theory of the relationship between the material world and what lies beyond it, a theory that was held by most of the human beings who have ever lived, and that the Scottish megalithic builders apparently held with enough conviction to invest thousands of hours of labour in creating monuments that put them regularly and reliably at exactly that point. The dark reason Scotland has more standing stones than any other country in Europe is inseparable from this. The darkness is not in the intention of the builders, who were trying, by their lights, to do something profoundly hopeful, to make contact with the forces that governed their world, and to ensure, through that contact, the continuation of the conditions that made life possible. The darkness is in the distance between that intention and us, in the impossibility of recovering fully what they believed and felt and experienced in these places, in the way the stones outlast the meanings that were placed in them and become something different, something stripped of its original context, something that can be documented and dated and measured, but not quite understood. And there is one more dimension of darkness in the story of the Scottish standing stones that we have not yet addressed, a dimension that is in some ways the most troubling of all. It concerns not just what the stones were, but what happened to the people who built them, and what the pattern of that happening tells us about the nature of the crisis that the stones were perhaps built to address. Around 1500 BCE, something happened in Scotland that the archaeological record captures with unusual clarity. The stone building stopped, not slowly, not gradually, not through the long decline that sometimes marks the end of cultural traditions, but abruptly, within what seems, on the timescale of prehistory, to be a very short period. Sites that had been built, used, modified, and expanded over centuries simply ceased to receive new additions. New stone circles were no longer erected. The complex astronomical alignments that had been the work of generations of specialist knowledge were no longer embodied in new monuments. The tradition of megalithic construction that had persisted in Scotland for more than 2,000 years came to an end. This does not mean the existing stones were abandoned immediately or that the sites were no longer visited. The evidence suggests that many of the stone circles and related monuments continued to be used for various purposes, including burial, for considerable periods after the main phase of construction ended. But the building stopped, and with the building stopped something that the building represented. What happened around 1500 BCE that could account for this sudden ending? The answer, or part of it, is visible in the pollen record preserved in Scottish peat bogs. Pollen cores from multiple sites across Scotland show, dating to the period between approximately 1500 and 1000 BCE, a dramatic decline in tree pollen and a corresponding increase in the pollen of grasses, heathland plants, and blanket bog vegetation. This is the pollen signature of a landscape undergoing rapid change, a landscape in which the complex mosaic of woodland, farmland, and managed ground that had characterized the Neolithic and early Bronze Age was being replaced by the more impoverished, less productive landscape of heathland and peat. This landscape transformation was the result of the intersection of two forces. The first was the climate deterioration that we mentioned earlier, the 3.2 kiloyear event that brought cooler, wetter conditions to northwestern Europe, beginning around 1200 BCE and continuing for several centuries. The second force was the accumulated impact of millennia of human activity. The Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples of Scotland had been farming the landscape for 2,000 years or more. They had cleared forests for farmland, grazed livestock on hillsides, used wood for fuel and construction, and the firing of pottery. Slowly, imperceptibly, in any single generation, but unmistakably across the span of centuries, their activity had degraded the soil, removed the natural vegetation that had held it in place, and created the conditions in which blanket peat could begin to form and spread. Blanket peat formation is a self-reinforcing process. Once peat begins to form, it changes the hydrology of the landscape in ways that promote further peat formation. The waterlogged, acidic conditions under the peat kill the soil bacteria that decompose organic matter, causing dead vegetation to accumulate rather than decompose, building up the peat layer year after year. As the peat spreads, it buries and seals the old farmland beneath it, rendering it permanently unavailable for agriculture. The landscape that had supported farming communities for 2,000 years was being steadily consumed by the peat that their own activity had helped to create. The people who had built the standing stones were watching their world end. Not with the sudden drama of a volcanic eruption or an earthquake, but with the slow, relentless advance of the bog over farmland, year after year, decade after decade. The crops that had grown where now there was only wet heath. The fields that had fed their grandparents now smothered under a deepening layer of waterlogged peat. The communities that had organized themselves to build the great monuments, that had maintained traditions of astronomical observation and specialist knowledge over centuries, were being forced to contract, to abandon their more exposed and marginal settlements, to compete for the dwindling areas of land that were still productive. In this context, the cessation of monument building takes on a new meaning. It is not the end of a tradition that had simply run its course, that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. It is the end of a tradition that required more than the crisis-ridden communities of late Bronze Age Scotland could sustain. Building stone monuments requires surplus, requires that the community can afford to devote significant labour to activities that are not directly productive. When communities are under severe stress, when they are fighting the advancing peat and the cooling climate and each other for the remaining productive land, that surplus disappears. The stones that had been built during better times remained, but no new ones could be added to them. The tradition was not abandoned, it was simply overwhelmed. And then, sometime between 1000 and 800 BCE, the peat buried many of the stones. Not all of them, and not completely, but the accumulation of peat around the bases of the stones at many sites, including Callanish, where the peat eventually rose to cover the bases of the stones and filled the spaces between them, effectively removed those sites from active use and from the memory of the communities living nearby. A community that had, within living memory, used a stone circle for ceremony and had passed down knowledge of the circle's astronomical significance through generations of oral tradition, was now looking at a landscape where the peat had risen to the height of the visible portions of the stones, and the site was no longer accessible in any practical sense. This burial by peat was not entirely negative in its effects. As the excavation of Callanish in the 1850s demonstrated, the peat preserved the stones and their settings in a state of remarkable completeness. The peat that buried the site also protected it, keeping out the weather and the processes of erosion that have damaged many exposed megalithic monuments. The peat was a slow catastrophe that turned itself, paradoxically, into a preservation event. But in the shorter term, in the Bronze Age and Iron Age centuries, when the burial was happening, it was simply loss. The stones were going under, and with them, the knowledge and the traditions and the meanings that had been invested in them over more than 1,000 years. There is something almost unbearably poignant about imagining the last generations of the Bronze Age communities who had maintained the tradition of the stones. Watching the peat rise and knowing that what was being covered was not merely a set of old stones, but the accumulated astronomical and ceremonial knowledge of their ancestors, knowledge that they could not write down because they had no writing, that they could not photograph or record in any way that would allow it to be recovered, that existed only in memory and in the alignment of stones that were going underwater in the bog. Some of that knowledge was probably preserved in oral tradition, carried forward into the Iron Age and transmitted in forms we no longer recognize as connected to the stones. But much of it was simply lost, as surely and as completely as if the sea had risen and swallowed it. And it was. Not the sea, but the peat, which in the end accomplishes much the same thing. The Doggerland of the Neolithic mental landscape was swallowed not by salt water, but by the slow black tide of the bog. And what went under with it? The names the builders gave themselves, the language they spoke, the stories they told about the stones, the ceremonies they performed within them, the astronomical knowledge that allowed them to build monuments aligned to the 18.6-year lunar cycle, the meanings they gave to what they saw when the moon walked through the avenue at Callanish and descended behind the southern hill. All of this is gone as completely as the settlements of Doggerland. Gone not because it was deliberately destroyed, but because time and peat are more patient than any human institution. This is the darkest thing about the Scottish standing stones. Not the crisis that may have driven the intensification of their construction, not the difficult and possibly desperate circumstances of the communities that built them, not the astronomical knowledge they encoded that required generations of patient observation in a dark northern landscape to accumulate. The darkest thing is the erasure the way 5,000 years of accumulated human knowledge, preserved not in libraries or archives or written records, but in the positioning of stones and the traditions of communities who knew how to read them, simply went away. Not all at once, not through any single catastrophic event, but gradually, as the peat rose and the traditions weakened, and the communities that had maintained the knowledge were dispersed and absorbed, and eventually replaced by people who did not know what the stones meant. We can measure the stones, we can date them, we can map their alignments and calculate what astronomical events they were oriented to. We can study the human bones found at their bases, and the pottery found in their precincts, and the pollen preserved in the peat that surrounds them. All of this is valuable, and all of it tells us something real about the people who built and used these places. But it tells us the way a house tells you about the people who lived in it after they are gone. The furniture is there, arranged by their hands. The walls still show the marks they made. But the conversations they had in those rooms, the feelings they had walking through those spaces, the particular quality of what it felt like to be one of them, standing in this circle on the morning of the solstice, watching the light touch the stones in the way they had been positioned to be touched, that is inaccessible to us. Not because we are insufficiently clever, not because archaeology lacks the tools, but because some things can only be known from the inside, from within the tradition, from within the community, from within the shared understanding that allowed the knowledge encoded in the stones to make sense. And we are irretrievably on the outside of that. The outside view is not without value. It has produced the beautiful map of alignments, the careful radiocarbon dates, the analysis of the trading networks that connected these communities across vast distances, the reconstruction of the climate changes that stressed and eventually overwhelmed their agricultural systems. All of this is real knowledge, and it matters, but it coexists with an absence that should make us humble. The stones know things we do not. They were built to hold knowledge, to embody it permanently in their alignment, and they have been doing so for 5,000 years with admirable faithfulness. The problem is on our side, not theirs. We have forgotten how to read them fully. This problem of forgetting is not unique to Scotland or to the megalithic monuments. It is a feature of the relationship between all modern societies and their deep past. But it is particularly acute in the Scottish case, because the tradition that encoded the knowledge in the stones was already a tradition of encoding, already a way of preserving knowledge in a form intended to outlast the minds that created it. The builders of the megalithic monuments knew they were mortal and their tradition vulnerable. That is presumably one reason they built in stone rather than in wood or earth, materials that would decay within lifetimes rather than enduring for millennia. They were trying to make their knowledge permanent. They mostly succeeded in preserving the physical form of what they built. The meaning has not fared as well. But perhaps we are slightly more capable of reading the stones than we give ourselves credit for. Perhaps what has been preserved in the Scottish landscape is not quite as illegible as the depth of the loss suggests, because there is a dimension of the standing stone tradition that has been the subject of remarkable new research in the last 2 decades, research that has not yet been widely publicized outside specialist circles, but that has implications that go beyond anything the mainstream coverage of Scottish megalithic monuments has suggested. It concerns the geometry. When archaeologists and surveyors began mapping the Scottish standing stones systematically, starting in the 18th century and intensifying in the 20th, they were primarily interested in individual monuments. They measured the diameters of stone circles, calculated the alignments of avenues, documented the positions and dimensions of individual stones. This site-by-site approach produced a tremendous amount of valuable information. But it missed something that becomes apparent only when you step back from the individual sites and look at the landscape as a whole. When you map all of the significant standing stone sites in certain regions of Scotland and draw lines between them, you find that the sites are not positioned randomly. They are not arranged in the random distribution that you would expect if each community had simply built in the most convenient local location. They are arranged in patterns, not simple patterns, not patterns so obvious that they leap out of a casual map reading, but systematic geometric patterns that appear to reflect deliberate positioning of sites relative to each other across distances of tens and sometimes hundreds of kilometers. The first researcher to draw serious academic attention to this phenomenon was Alexander Thom, a Scottish engineer who spent decades of his retirement systematically surveying British megalithic monuments and applying statistical analysis to their geometry. Thom's work, published in a series of books and papers between the 1950s and the 1970s, was initially met with skepticism by archaeologists, who found his claims too precise to be credible, too aligned with a modernist engineering sensibility that he was projecting onto the past. Some of his specific claims, particularly his claim that the builders of megalithic monuments used a standard unit of measurement he called the megalithic yard, have remained controversial and are still debated, but the underlying observation that the geometry of megalithic monuments shows regularities that cannot be explained by chance has proven more durable. Subsequent researchers, using more sophisticated statistical methods and larger datasets, have confirmed that some of Thom's observations were real. There are regularities in the geometry of Scottish megalithic sites that require explanation. The most interesting of these regularities involve not the geometry within individual sites, but the spatial relationships between sites across the landscape. What some researchers have found, and what is still being debated and refined, is that certain clusters of standing stone sites in Scotland appear to be positioned relative to each other in ways that reflect awareness of a larger geographic structure. The sites are not simply built to be locally functional. They appear to have been positioned to be part of something larger, a network of sites whose positions relative to each other encode information or relationships that were meaningful at a regional scale rather than a purely local one. The specific form of this larger structure varies by region. In some areas, the relationships between sites appear to be primarily astronomical, with lines between sites aligning with significant astronomical events at the specific latitude of the sites. In other areas, the relationships appear to be more geometric, with sites positioned at the vertices of triangles or other geometric figures with specific mathematical properties. And in some areas, the relationships appear to combine astronomical and geometric elements in ways that suggest the builders were simultaneously tracking celestial events and maintaining a sophisticated understanding of the geometry of the landscape. This is where the research becomes genuinely difficult to assess, because the claims range from the well-documented and credible to the highly speculative and contested. The astronomical alignments within individual sites, like the Callanish Major Standstill alignment, are documented with sufficient precision that they are now accepted by most mainstream archaeologists as genuine. The long-distance geometric relationships between sites are considerably more contested, partly because the evidence is less precise and partly because the implications are more uncomfortable. The implications are uncomfortable because they require the builders to have had a working knowledge of the geography of Scotland at a scale that, by conventional assessments of the technology available to them, they should not have possessed. To position sites relative to each other across distances of hundreds of kilometers in ways that encode systematic geometric relationships, you need to know where those sites are relative to each other. In the modern world, we know this from maps and GPS. In the Neolithic world, there were no maps and no instruments of precision measurement. The knowledge of large-scale geography had to come from somewhere, and the conventional explanations for where it could have come from are not fully satisfying. Some researchers argue that the knowledge came from the cumulative experience of centuries of travel, that communities who ranged widely across Scotland in pursuit of seasonal resources, trade goods, and marriage partners built up over generations an increasingly accurate mental map of the landscape. This is plausible. Human beings are remarkably good at building mental maps of the territories they regularly traverse, and communities that travelled widely over long periods could certainly have developed accurate knowledge of the relative positions of distant landmarks, including the locations of existing stone monuments. But this explanation is more comfortable when applied to the local and regional geometry than to the larger scale patterns. For patterns extending across hundreds of kilometers to be built into the positioning of stone monuments, the builders needed not just mental maps based on personal experience of travel, but some way of communicating and standardizing geographic knowledge across communities separated by great distances. They needed, in effect, a way of doing what modern cartography does, of expressing the relationships between distant points in a form that could be communicated and used by people who had not personally travelled between those points. How this could have been accomplished without writing or sophisticated instruments is a genuine puzzle, and it is a puzzle that the mainstream of archaeology has not yet adequately addressed. The usual response is to question whether the long-distance geometric patterns are real, to point out that with enough sites in a landscape, you can always find geometric relationships between some subset of them by chance, and to suggest that the researchers who have identified these patterns are seeing what they want to see. This is a legitimate methodological concern, and it needs to be addressed rigorously, but it is also sometimes a way of avoiding an uncomfortable implication, rather than genuinely engaging with it. The uncomfortable implication is that the builders of the Scottish standing stones may have been considerably more sophisticated in their understanding of geography, geometry, and spatial relationships than the conventional picture of Neolithic society allows, that they may have had ways of representing and communicating large-scale spatial information that we have not identified because we have been looking for something that resembles modern cartography rather than something that might encode spatial information in a completely different way. That the standing stones themselves, individually and as a network, may have been not just monuments and observatories, but elements of a geographic information system built in stone, a system for representing and communicating spatial relationships in a form that required no instruments to use but only the knowledge of how to read it. If this is true, even partially, it changes our understanding of what was lost when the tradition of the stones ended. It was not only astronomical knowledge and ceremonial practice and whatever beliefs those practices expressed. It was also a system of geographic representation, a way of knowing and communicating about the landscape at scale that has no obvious modern analogue. And it has been gone for more than 3,000 years, buried under the peat along with the rest of what the stones knew. The Orkney sites are central to this wider discussion for a reason that goes beyond their individual significance. They are central because they were not isolated. The archaeological evidence from Orkney, and particularly from the Ring of Brodgar complex, suggests that Orkney in the Neolithic period was connected to the rest of Scotland and to Britain, more widely by networks of exchange and relationship that were more extensive and more organised than the standard picture of scattered farming communities implies. The isotope evidence of cattle brought from mainland Scotland, the presence of grooved ware pottery in identical styles from Orkney to Wiltshire, the careful construction of monuments to astronomical specifications that were meaningful at the latitude of Orkney, but would have required adjustment if applied elsewhere. All of this speaks of connection, of communication, of shared knowledge maintained across large distances. What was being maintained across those distances was not just trade. Trade can happen between communities who know nothing about each other beyond what is needed to exchange goods. What was being maintained was something more like a shared intellectual project, the sustained observation of the sky and the building of monuments that embodied and communicated the results of those observations, carried out by specialists who travelled between communities and who held in common a body of knowledge that transcended the boundaries of any single tribe or region. This shared intellectual project, sustained across more than 2,000 years and expressed in thousands of stone monuments, scattered across a landscape that extends from the Outer Hebrides to the border country and beyond, is perhaps the most extraordinary achievement of Neolithic Scotland. More extraordinary than any individual monument, however impressive. More extraordinary than the astronomical alignments, however precise. Because it required not just knowledge, but the capacity to maintain and transmit knowledge across time and space in a society without writing, without institutions in the modern sense, without any of the infrastructure that we normally associate with sustained intellectual achievement. And then it ended. The climate cooled, the crops failed, the peat rose, and the tradition that had built the monuments and given them their meaning gradually lost the social and material conditions it needed to survive. The specialists dispersed or died without passing on the full depth of their knowledge. The communities that had sustained the tradition for so long contracted and changed and eventually transformed into peoples whose relationship to the old monuments was one of wonder rather than understanding. And the stones patiently stood on. It would be too easy to end the story there. The loss is real and should be acknowledged, but the story of the Scottish standing stones does not end with the Bronze Age crisis or the rising peat. It continues in unexpected ways through the Iron Age and the medieval period and into modernity, and some of what it continues as is not the cheerful heritage tourism that surrounds sites like Callanish today, but something considerably more complicated and in places genuinely dark in the ordinary sense of the word. The medieval period in Scotland was not a time of enlightened preservation of ancient monuments. The standing stones were not admired as cultural heritage or studied as archaeological sites. They were in many cases feared. The folklore that accumulated around them during the medieval period is consistently unsettling, consistently associated with danger, with the supernatural, with powers that were not to be engaged with lightly. The stories told about the stones in medieval and early modern Scotland are not the stories of a culture that has forgotten the stones, but of a culture that remembers that the stones are powerful and has lost the understanding of what kind of power they embody and how to interact with it safely. The Callanish stones were called Ferbrig in Scottish Gaelic, which means false men, or alternatively, in some usages, petrified men. The story was that they had been humans, a community of great men who had refused to convert to Christianity and had been turned to stone by St. Kieran as punishment. This story is an obvious overlay of Christian mythology onto a much older site, a way of explaining the inexplicable within the only available framework of meaning, which in medieval Scotland was Christian. But the story is also revealing in what it preserves beneath the overlay. The stones were understood to have been people. They had agency. They had, at some point, made a choice. And the consequences of that choice were permanent. Other Scottish standing stone sites attracted different but consistently uncanny stories. The Rollright stones in England, which is not Scotland but is a useful comparison point, were said to be a king and his army who had been turned to stone by a witch. The Merry Maidens in Cornwall were young women turned to stone for dancing on a Sunday. These transformation myths appear around standing stones across Britain, and they consistently preserve the same underlying structure. The stones were people. Something happened. They are frozen in the moment before their transformation, permanent testimony to whatever it was that happened. What is striking about this consistent narrative pattern is that it is not completely wrong, only wrong in the specifics. The stones were not individual humans transformed by divine or magical punishment, but they are the product of human beings, human intention, human knowledge, human belief. They do embody something about the people who built them. They are, in a real sense, the people who built them, not individually, but collectively, in the way that any great work embodies its makers. The medieval folk imagination that insisted on seeing the stones as petrified people was reaching, without the vocabulary to express it precisely, toward a genuine truth. The stones are a frozen moment of human culture, a culture that was transformed by time and climate and displacement and forgetting into something it can never return from. There is also in the Scottish medieval tradition around standing stones a consistent thread of caution, of warning, of the sense that engagement with the stones is potentially dangerous and should not be undertaken casually. People were warned not to sleep overnight at stone circles, not to remove stones from their positions, not to count the stones because the act of counting was said to produce a different total each time and to bring bad luck to the counter, not to dance within a stone circle, which was a particularly persistent prohibition across Britain and Ireland and which resulted in many of the transformation myths, the Merry Maidens and their like being specifically about dancing. The prohibition on dancing within the circles is interesting because dancing is not an obvious activity for anyone to undertake at a standing stone site, unless the tradition of dancing at such sites was already well established enough to need active suppression. Medieval prohibitions tend to be prohibitions of things that were actually happening rather than purely hypothetical activities. If people were being warned not to dance at the stone circles, people were dancing at the stone circles. And if they were dancing there, they were doing so because the tradition of using the circles for some form of movement-based ceremony, a tradition with roots going back to the Neolithic, had never entirely died out. This is a small piece of evidence, but it points towards something important. The tradition of the stones did not simply end when the monument building stopped. It went underground, so to speak. The public, official, socially approved tradition of building and using the monuments gave way under the pressure of climate crisis and population displacement, and eventually the coming of Christianity, to a set of folk practices that preserved something of the original tradition in a changed and fragmentary form. These folk practices were suppressed by the Church, which is why the medieval records describe them primarily in the form of prohibitions and the stories of supernatural punishment for violation of those prohibitions. But suppression is not elimination. The folk practices continued in increasingly disguised and attenuated forms, probably into the early modern period, and in some places possibly later. The best documented form in which practices connected to the standing stones continued into the historical period is the tradition of circular movement around sacred sites that is found across Scotland and Ireland and known in the Gaelic tradition as Deisile, meaning sunwise or clockwise, the direction of movement appropriate for lucky, beneficial, or sacred purposes. Walking sunwise around a sacred object or within a sacred enclosure is attested in Gaelic tradition from the medieval period onward, and the objects and enclosures around which people walked sunwise include, among other things, standing stones and stone circles. The tradition of walking sunwise around the Callanish Stones at Beltane, the Celtic festival marking the beginning of summer on the 1st of May, is documented in 18th century descriptions of practices on the Isle of Lewis, practices that were already beginning to fade by that date, but that were still remembered as having been customary within living memory. What the tradition of sunwise walking around the stones preserves is a fragment, probably a fragment of a much larger and more complex ceremonial practice, of the original function of the circles as spaces within which movement in specific patterns had specific meanings. The full meaning of that movement, what it was meant to accomplish and what its practitioners believed about its effects, is no longer recoverable. But the movement itself, the sunwise circuit of the circle, was preserved in folk practice for thousands of years after the original tradition that gave it meaning had ended. It is, in a very small way, a reading of the stones, an incomplete and perhaps largely unconscious one, but a reading nonetheless. And it may not be entirely alone. There are scholars of Celtic literature and mythology who have argued that elements of the Gaelic literary tradition, the great cycles of myth and legend that were written down in Ireland and Scotland, beginning in the early medieval period, preserve within their narrative structures traces of knowledge that has its roots in the Neolithic megalithic tradition. These arguments are speculative and contested, but they are not frivolous. The oral traditions that eventually crystallized into the medieval Irish and Scottish literature were old, perhaps very old, and they encoded knowledge in the form of story in a way that was consistent with the ancient tradition of preserving information in memorable, narrative form. The specific correspondences that have been proposed between elements of Gaelic mythology and the astronomical knowledge encoded in the megalithic monuments are too detailed to survey in full here. But one example is worth noting because it is both specific enough to be testable and sufficiently well supported to have been taken seriously by researchers in both archaeology and literary studies. The Irish mythological figure of the Dagda, a god associated with the earth and with fertility and with the passage of the seasons, is described in medieval Irish texts as the owner of a great cauldron that was never empty. The Dagda's cauldron is one of the 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, the supernatural beings of pre-Christian Irish mythology, and it is consistently associated with abundance, with the feeding of all who came to it, with the inexhaustible provision of nourishment. This mythological motif, the inexhaustible vessel of nourishment, is common in world mythology and in itself tells us relatively little, but the Dagda is also described in ways that connect him specifically to the timing of the seasons, to the solstices and equinoxes, to the transitions between the seasons that mark the agricultural year, and the association of the inexhaustible cauldron with the timing of the seasons connects, at a deep structural level, to the function of the megalithic monuments as systems for tracking the celestial events that governed the agricultural calendar. The stones that mark the solstices and equinoxes, that orient communities to the turning points of the year, that allow the accurate prediction of the times appropriate for planting and harvesting, are doing, in material and astronomical form, exactly what the mythological cauldron of the Dagda does in narrative form. They ensure that the community does not go hungry. They are the guarantors of the agricultural system's proper functioning. And if the mythological tradition that the Dagda represents has roots in the same Neolithic culture that built the standing stones, then the inexhaustible cauldron and the precisely aligned stone circle are different expressions of the same underlying concept, different ways of encoding the same knowledge about the relationship between celestial cycles and agricultural abundance. This is a connection that cannot be proven. It may be wrong. The mythological tradition and the monument building tradition may have developed independently, and the apparent connection may be an artifact of the tendency of human minds to find patterns. But it is the kind of connection that becomes more, rather than less interesting, the more carefully you look at it. The kind of connection that fits too well into too many other elements of the picture to be dismissed without examination. And it points toward a possibility that is both modest and significant. The possibility that the tradition of the Scottish standing stones did not end when the building stopped and the peat rose. That it continued, transformed and fragmented, and partially lost, but never entirely extinguished, in the oral traditions and folk practices and mythological literature of the peoples who succeeded the original builders. That some of what was encoded in the stones was also encoded in stories, in the kind of story that survives because it is memorable and useful, and because it connects to something real in the experience of the community that tells it. That the knowledge, or some significant portion of it, is still there to be found by anyone who knows how to look for it in the right places. The standing stones of Scotland are not dead. They are waiting. They have been waiting for 5,000 years, which is not long on their timescale, and they will wait as long as they need to. The peat that buried some of them has been stripped away. The astronomical alignments they encode have been measured and verified. The network of connections that linked them to each other and to communities across Scotland and Britain is being mapped with increasing precision. The knowledge is not gone. It is merely out of reach, for now, at the distance that 5,000 years of forgetting has placed it. But forgetting, unlike the peat, is not permanent. We are remembering, slowly, incompletely. With many errors and false starts, we are reading the stones again. And what we are reading there, in the alignment of ancient gneiss to the arc of a moon that rose for the last time through the southern avenue of Callanish, more than 3,000 years ago, is something that the builders wanted us eventually to find. They built in stone because they wanted to be remembered. They aligned their stones to the sky because they wanted to be understood. They built more of them in Scotland than anywhere else in Europe because they needed to say something very urgently. And saying it urgently required saying it in many places, many times, over many centuries, in the most permanent material available. The stones are not only monuments, they are a message. And the dark reason Scotland has so many of them is that the people who built them had so much that they desperately needed to say. Let us now come closer to the ground, away from the long view of civilizational collapse and geological time, and look at what we actually know about the specific stones and the specific places and the specific strange things that happen when you visit them. Because one of the most consistent and least discussed aspects of the Scottish standing stones is the effect they have on contemporary visitors, not the tourists who arrive in tour buses and take photographs and leave, not the day trippers who find Callanish conveniently located near a car park with an interpretive centre, not the professional archaeologists who visit with measuring tapes and GPS units and notebooks, but the visitors who come slowly, who stay long, who sit with the stones in the early morning or the late evening when the other people have gone, who spend time in these places the way the original builders probably spent time in them, which is to say, in relative silence and with something other than measurement or documentation in mind. What those visitors consistently report is not dramatic. It is not the kind of thing that makes good newspaper copy or that fits naturally into the register of paranormal tourism. It is quieter than that and more difficult to dismiss because it is so consistent and because the people reporting it are so consistently unwilling to exaggerate or sensationalize. What they report is a quality of attention, a heightened awareness of the sensory environment, of the wind and the light and the texture of the stone, that feels different from ordinary sensory experience in a way that is hard to describe precisely. A sense of being in a place that has been used, that carries the residue of long use, the way an old church or an old library carries the residue of all the attention that has been concentrated there over the centuries. A sense, sometimes, of something that is not quite presence, but is also not quite absence. A quality of the place that makes solitude feel less than entirely complete. None of this is proof of anything. None of it is evidence in the archaeological sense. The reports may reflect nothing more than the power of expectation and suggestion, the way knowing you are standing in a place of acknowledged ancient significance colors the experience of being there. The heightened sensory awareness may simply be the natural consequence of visiting a wild and beautiful landscape with the specific intention of paying close attention. The sense of layered use may be entirely a product of imagination, supplied with the knowledge of what these places were. But it is worth noting that the people who built the standing stones were not primarily building for future tourists. They were not building places that would be impressive from the outside, that would photograph well, that would make good heritage sites. They were building places that would work from the inside, that would function as they were intended to function, when used in the ways they were intended to be used. And those intended uses were primarily experiential, primarily about the quality of what it was like to be in these places at specific times and in specific conditions. If the stones were built to create a specific quality of experience, a quality associated with the liminal, with the threshold, with the thinning of whatever boundary the builders believed existed between the ordinary and the extraordinary, then the fact that contemporary visitors still report something of that quality is not surprising. The stones are still there, the landscape is still there, the astronomical alignments are still there. The specific quality of light at midsummer morning still touches the stones in the way it was positioned to touch them 5,000 years ago. Whatever the builders were trying to create, they created something durable. The experience of the stones is part of what has survived, and the experience of the stones is ultimately what this entire story is about. Not the statistics of monument density, not the astronomical calculations, not the climate data and the pollen cores and the isotope analyses, all of which are real and important and true. What the story is about at its deepest level is the human experience of standing in a landscape that has been marked deliberately and permanently by people who lived and believed and struggled and finally disappeared, and feeling the distance between yourself and them, and feeling also perhaps something that is not quite distance, something that the stone and the alignment and the long patience of the waiting place have kept for you across all the centuries between. The dark reason Scotland has more standing stones than any other country in Europe is that the people who built them needed them more urgently than anyone else. They were at the edge of the world they knew, facing a climate that was turning against them, watching their agricultural systems fail in slow motion across generations, maintaining in the face of everything a tradition of sky watching and monument building and community knowledge that was older than any of the crises they faced, and that they perhaps believed, with the desperate faith of people who have nothing stronger to put between themselves and the void, was the only thing that stood between them and the end of everything. They were not wrong that the tradition was worth preserving. They were not wrong that the knowledge encoded in the stones deserved to outlast the crisis. They built well enough that the stones are still there, 5,000 years later, and the knowledge, however fragmented and however difficult to read, is still there within them. The crisis did not end the tradition. The tradition, in the form of the stones themselves, outlasted the crisis and everything that came after it. And now we are standing here, at this improbable remove from the people who built them, looking at what they left us and trying to understand what they were trying to say. They were trying to say that the sky moves in patterns that can be understood. They were trying to say that the place where you stand in relation to those patterns matters, that some places are better than others for understanding what the patterns mean and for aligning yourself with the forces they represent. They were trying to say that the knowledge is worth having, is worth the labor of building monuments to hold it, is worth the effort of passing it down through generations in the only form available to a culture without writing, which is the form of stones precisely placed and traditions carefully maintained. And they were trying to say something else, something that is harder to translate into the language of the present moment, but that the stones themselves still say, quietly, to anyone who stands among them for long enough. They were trying to say that they were here, that they mattered, that the particular way they understood the world, the particular relationship they had with the sky, and the land and the movements of the celestial bodies was worth remembering. That even if everything else about them was lost, even if their names and language and beliefs and social structures all went under the peat, the stones would remain to testify that they had existed and that they had paid careful attention to the world they lived in. The stones are that testimony. They are still standing. And in Scotland, where the conditions were hardest and the need most urgent and the tradition deepest and oldest, there are more of them than anywhere else in Europe. Not because Scotland was the most powerful or the most prosperous or the most advanced region of prehistoric Europe, but because it was the place where, more than anywhere else, the people needed to be heard, needed to leave something behind that would outlast the crisis and the forgetting and the long patience of the peat. And so they built and built and kept on building until the building stopped. And the stones stood on, as they stand on now, waiting for us to find the words to say what they have been saying all along. There is a stone on the Isle of Islay, in the southern part of the Inner Hebrides, that stands alone in a field with no circle around it, no avenue of accompanying stones, no obvious relationship to any other monument in the landscape. It is about 2 meters tall, planted firmly in the earth with the casual permanence of somethings that has always been there and expects to continue being there indefinitely. Local tradition calls it the Standing Stone of Coltoun, and it has been in that field for approximately 4,000 years. Around it, the agricultural work of successive generations has been carried out, ploughs going past it, fences going around it, the daily work of the farm accommodating itself to the presence of the stone, the way water accommodates a rock in a stream. Nobody knows why it is there. Nobody knows what it marked or aligned to or commemorated. It simply stands, in a field on Islay, doing whatever it has been doing for 4,000 years, in a silence that has absorbed every question asked of it. There are thousands of stones like this across Scotland. Not the famous ones, not the ones with interpretive centres and car parks and scholarly monographs devoted to them. The unnamed ones, the unresearched ones, the ones that are known locally, because they have always been there, and that appear in the National Monument Record as single standing stones of unknown date and unknown function. These stones collectively represent an enormous investment of Neolithic and Bronze Age human labour, an investment whose distribution across the landscape does not cluster conveniently around the major known monument complexes, but is scattered across the hills and moorlands and farmlands of Scotland in a way that suggests the tradition of stone erection was not confined to specialised ceremonial centres, but extended into the everyday landscape, into the fields and the hillsides where ordinary communities lived and worked. Why would ordinary communities, farming communities without the resources or the specialist knowledge that went into a monument like Callanish or the Ring of Brodgar, erect standing stones in their fields? The conventional answers are several: boundary markers, property markers, memorials to the dead, waymarkers on routes across the landscape. All of these are plausible, and none of them is necessarily wrong, but they are also oddly modest explanations for an activity that required significant physical effort, that clearly had cultural meaning given its widespread and sustained adoption, and that persisted for at least 2,000 years across the full extent of the Scottish landscape. The most interesting possibility, and the one that the evidence best supports when considered holistically, is that the single standing stones were elements of a widely shared practice of marking significant relationships between the human community and the landscape. relationships that were understood in both practical and sacred terms simultaneously, in the way that many pre-modern cultures do not draw a clear line between the practical and the sacred. A stone erected at the boundary of a community's territory was not just a legal marker in the way a modern boundary marker is. It was also an assertion of the community's relationship with the land, a physical statement of belonging, a way of making permanent and visible the relationship that the community believed it had with the particular piece of landscape it occupied. This understanding of the stones as expressions of relationship, rather than simply markers of fact, has implications for how we read the landscape of Scotland as a whole. If the stones were not just functional markers, but were expressions of a community's relationship to its landscape, then the density of stones in Scotland reflects not just a high level of monument building activity, but a particularly intense and sustained engagement with the concept of belonging, of having a relationship with the land that needed to be expressed in permanent material form. And that intensity of engagement with belonging may itself reflect the difficulty of the relationship, the precariousness of the Scottish agricultural community's hold on a landscape that was genuinely difficult, that could, and sometimes did, fail them catastrophically, and that required constant attention and constant expression of commitment to maintain. You belong more fiercely to a landscape that threatens to expel you than to one that welcomes you without reservation. The standing stones of Scotland may be, among other things, an expression of that fierce belonging, the claiming of a landscape by a people who knew that the landscape was not entirely on their side, who could not take their continued presence in it for granted, and who built permanent stone monuments to assert their claim to it in the most durable form available to them. This fierce belonging has a geographical dimension that is worth exploring. Scotland is not a geographically unified country in any simple sense. It is a collection of dramatically different landscapes compressed into a relatively small area, from the fertile river valleys of the south and east to the mountain massifs of the central Highlands, to the island chains of the Hebrides, to the low moorlands of Orkney and Caithness. Each of these landscapes presented different challenges to its Neolithic and Bronze Age inhabitants, different conditions of soil and climate and topography that required different adaptive strategies, and that shaped the communities that lived in them in different ways. The distribution of standing stones across these different landscapes is not uniform. It reflects the different ways in which different communities engaged with the tradition of stone erection, adapted it to their local conditions, and integrated it into their local practice. In Orkney, the tradition produced the great formal circles and the complex ceremonial monuments of the Brodgar Peninsula. In the Outer Hebrides, it produced Callanish and its associated network of monuments spread across the Lewis Moorland. In Argyll and the Inner Hebrides, it produced the stone rows and complex settings of Kilmartin Glen, which is itself one of the most concentrated areas of prehistoric monument building in Scotland. In Perthshire and Aberdeenshire, it produced the recumbent stone circles, a specifically northeastern Scottish variant of the stone circle tradition, in which one large stone is laid on its side between two tall flanking stones in the southwestern arc of the circle, a feature found nowhere else in Britain and that appears to reflect a specific astronomical or ceremonial function related to the moonrise over the recumbent stone. The recumbent stone circles of northeastern Scotland deserve particular attention because they are one of the clearest examples of regional variation within the Scottish megalithic tradition, one of the clearest indicators that the tradition was not a single monolithic practice, but a family of related practices that developed differently in different parts of Scotland in response to local conditions, local knowledge, and local needs. There are more than 50 recumbent stone circles in Aberdeenshire and the adjacent areas of Kincardineshire and Banffshire, concentrated in an area roughly corresponding to the agricultural zone between the Grampian Mountains and the sea. They appear to have been built primarily between approximately 2900 and 1800 BCE, and they show a remarkable consistency of design across their entire geographic range. The recumbent stone is always in the southwestern arc. The flanking stones are always the tallest in the circle, positioned immediately adjacent to the recumbent stone. The circle grades in height from the flankers down toward the northeast, giving each circle a consistent visual profile when viewed from the center. And in many of the circles, the recumbent stone is positioned to frame the moonrise at the southern major standstill, the same astronomical event that is so dramatically marked at Callanish. The consistency of the recumbent stone circle design across a region encompassing hundreds of square kilometers and spanning more than 1,000 years of construction is striking. It suggests that the people who built these monuments were working within a tradition that was carefully maintained and transmitted across communities, that the specific design elements were not individual inventions, but inherited features whose meaning and function were understood and preserved. And the specific orientation of the recumbent stone to the major lunar standstill connects the northeastern Scottish tradition firmly to the broader Scottish tradition of lunar astronomy that we see at Callanish and in other monuments across the country. But the recumbent stone circles also have a feature that is not found at Callanish or at the Orcadian monuments, a feature that connects them more directly to the domestic life of the communities that built them. Many of the recumbent stone circles in Aberdeenshire contain, within the circle, the remains of ring cairns, circular mounds of stones that covered the cremated remains of the dead. The stone circles were not separate from the burial tradition in northeastern Scotland. They were integrated with it. The dead were buried within the circles, at the centre of the astronomical alignments, at the point of maximum significance in the cosmic landscape that the circle created. This integration of the dead with the astronomical monument is significant because it tells us something important about how these communities understood the relationship between the celestial cycles they were tracking and the lives and deaths of their members. The dead were placed at the center of the system that tracked the movements of the moon. They were oriented to the major lunar standstill in death in a way that presumably reflected something about how the community believed that the dead related to the celestial forces that governed life. The details of that belief are not recoverable, but the physical arrangement is clear. The dead and the moon were brought together at the center of the circle, and that bringing together was what the circle was for. This is a different emphasis from the tradition at Callanish, where the astronomical alignment is the primary feature and the burial evidence, though present, is secondary. At the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire, the astronomical and the funerary are of equal importance, integrated into a single practice that served both functions simultaneously. The circles were observatories and they were cemeteries, and these two functions were not in tension, but were aspects of a single understanding in which the dead and the movements of celestial bodies were understood to be in some meaningful relationship. What that relationship was, precisely, is a question that has been addressed by researchers from various perspectives, including astronomy, mythology, and comparative anthropology, none of which has produced a fully satisfying answer, but all of which have contributed to a picture that is becoming gradually clearer. The most common cross-cultural association between the moon and the dead involves the moon's cycle of apparent death and rebirth, the waxing and waning that takes it from full brilliance to invisible darkness and back again each month. In many cultures, this cycle has been understood as a model for human death and rebirth, a demonstration that darkness is not permanent, that what disappears from view may return. The placement of the dead at the center of a lunar observatory may reflect a belief that the dead, like the moon, were not gone, but only temporarily invisible, and that the time and manner of their return was governed by the same celestial cycles that the circle tracked. This is a beautiful belief and a coherent one, and there is no particular reason to doubt that it was held by the builders of the recumbent stone circles, but it does not fully account for the specific features of the tradition, particularly the specific emphasis on the major lunar standstill rather than the ordinary monthly cycle, the moment when the moon reaches the extreme southern point of its range and appears to pause before returning northward. The standstill is not a death and rebirth cycle. It is something different, a moment of maximum reach followed by retreat, a moment when the moon is at its furthest south and therefore, from the perspective of communities at the latitude of Scotland, at its closest to the horizon, apparently interacting with the landscape in the way that is so dramatically captured at Callanish. The standstill may have been understood as a moment of maximum contact between the moon and the earth, a moment when the two realms were closest, when whatever boundary existed between them was thinnest. And if the dead were believed to inhabit or to have access to the realm of the moon, then the standstill would be the moment when the dead were most accessible to the living, the moment when communication between the realms was most possible. The stone circles oriented to the standstill, and the dead buried at their centers, may have been designed to capture that moment of maximum contact, to be in the right place at the right time, to make use of the thinning of the boundary. This is speculative. It cannot be verified from the archaeological evidence alone, and it should not be presented as established fact. But it is consistent with the evidence. It is consistent with cross-cultural patterns in the anthropology of death and astronomical belief, and it has the merit of making sense of a feature of the recumbent stone circles that has always seemed slightly arbitrary, the specific orientation to the major lunar standstill, rather than to more accessible and more frequently occurring astronomical events. And it connects to the broader theme of this story, the idea that what the Scottish standing stones encode is not merely practical astronomical knowledge, but a way of understanding the world in which the movements of celestial bodies and the lives and deaths of human beings were understood to be an intimate relationship, a relationship that the stone monuments were built to nurture and maintain. Let us turn now to a dimension of the Scottish standing stone tradition that has received less attention than the astronomical alignments, but that is in some ways equally revealing: the sound. Stone circles produce unusual acoustic effects. This has been recognized by researchers for some decades, but the systematic study of the acoustics of megalithic monuments is relatively recent, and the results of that study are striking. Prehistoric stone circles are not acoustically neutral spaces. Many of them produce specific acoustic effects, reflections and resonances and interference patterns that are not present in the open landscape surrounding them. These effects vary depending on the size and arrangement of the stones, the materials from which they are made, and the geometry of the circle, but they are consistent enough across different sites to suggest that acoustic properties may have been a deliberate consideration in the design of at least some megalithic monuments. The most thoroughly studied of these acoustic effects is the production of standing waves within stone circles, patterns of sound in which certain frequencies are amplified while others are damped, creating a spatial pattern of loud and quiet zones within the circle. These standing waves are produced by the interference of sound waves reflected from the stones, and their frequency depends on the diameter of the circle and the spacing of the stones. In circles of the size typical of many Scottish monuments, the amplified frequencies tend to fall in a range that is musically significant in the range of deep drumming, of chanted bass notes, of the lower registers of the human voice. This has led some researchers to suggest that the acoustic properties of stone circles were not accidental, but were deliberately designed into the monuments. That the builders were aware of the acoustic effects that specific stone arrangements produced, and that they chose those arrangements at least partly on acoustic grounds. If this is right, and the evidence for it is suggestive rather than conclusive, then the stone circles were not only visual and astronomical instruments, but also acoustic instruments, designed to produce specific effects when sound was generated within them. Sound in enclosed or partially enclosed spaces affects human perception and physiology in ways that have been increasingly well documented. Specific frequencies can induce altered states of consciousness, reduce pain perception, change heart rate and breathing patterns, and create feelings of transcendence or unity that are distinct from ordinary sensory experience. These effects are not supernatural. They are neurological, the result of the way the human nervous system processes certain patterns of sound. But they are real, and they can be profound. The kind of drumming and chanting that characterizes ceremonial practice in many traditional cultures, including the kind of practice that the archaeoacoustic evidence suggests was likely taking place within Scottish stone circles, produces frequencies in exactly the range that is amplified by the acoustic properties of those circles. The combination of the amplified frequencies, the visual environment of the stones, and the social context of group ceremony could have produced experiences of considerable power, experiences that would have reinforced the sense of being in contact with something beyond the ordinary, something that the stones and the sky and the accumulated tradition of the place all pointed toward. This acoustic dimension of the Scottish standing stones has not been fully integrated into the standard narrative of what these monuments were and what they did. It tends to appear in specialist papers on archaeoacoustics and then not to migrate into the broader public understanding. But it matters because it adds a dimension to the picture of these places that the purely visual, purely astronomical account leaves out. The circles were full of sound as well as light. What happened in them was a total sensory experience, engaging hearing as well as sight, potentially altered states as well as ordinary consciousness, the physical experience of sound within the body as well as the visual experience of light touching stone. And that total sensory experience was the context within which the astronomical events were perceived. The major lunar standstill at Callanish, the solstice sunrise at Brodgar, the moonrise framed by the recumbent stone in Aberdeenshire. These were not observed by individuals standing quietly in the landscape with notebooks, making careful measurements. They were experienced by communities gathered within stone circles, perhaps in the context of ceremony involving drumming and chanting and fire and movement, in an altered state produced by the combination of the sensory environment and the social and emotional intensity of the occasion. The experience of seeing the moon walk through the southern avenue at Callanish and descend behind the hill would have been overwhelming in a way that it is almost impossible for a modern observer, arriving in a car and looking at a scheduled ancient monument in daylight, to reconstruct. The scale of the experience was the point. The stones were designed to create that scale, to frame the celestial event in a way that made it impossible to experience as merely astronomical, as merely a regular occurrence in the predictable mechanics of the solar system. The stones turned the event into an encounter with something that the people gathered within them believed to be real and powerful and responsive to their presence, to their ceremonies, to their careful maintenance of the tradition of watching and building that had been passed down to them from generations beyond memory. And that sort of encounter, that moment of maximum contact between the human community and the forces that governed their world, was the thing the stones were built to create, not to document, not to record for future generations who might find the alignments and calculate what astronomical event they were oriented to, but to experience in the immediate, overwhelming, total sensory present of the ceremony at the stone circle, surrounded by the sound and the fire and the community and the stones and the sky. We are the future generations who found the alignments and calculated what they were oriented to. And this is valuable, this is important, but it should not obscure the fact that we are receiving the skeleton of the tradition, the bones from which the flesh has long since gone. The astronomical alignment is the skeleton. The ceremony was the flesh, and the ceremony, the living practice of using the stones in the way they were intended to be used, is what cannot be recovered. There are people who would argue that it can be recovered, that the tradition of the stones, however transformed and fragmented, has continued in some form into the present, and that through careful scholarship and careful practice, it can be reconstructed in a form that is not exactly identical to the original, but is recognizably related to it. There are contemporary practitioners of various traditions, Druidic, shamanic, Wiccan, and others, who use the stone circles of Scotland as ceremonial spaces, who gather at Callanish at midsummer and at Brodgar at the winter solstice, who treat the sites as still active, still functional, still capable of facilitating the kind of experience their original builders intended them to facilitate. The relationship between these contemporary practices and the ancient tradition of the stones is complicated and contested. Most archaeologists are skeptical of claims of direct continuity between modern pagan practice and the Neolithic tradition. The gap in time is too large, the documented historical evidence for connecting links too sparse, the possibility of romantic invention or wishful thinking too significant to ignore. But skepticism of direct continuity is not the same as dismissal of the practices themselves. People gathering at stone circles to engage in ceremony are doing something that is structurally similar to what the original builders intended the circles to be used for, even if the specific content of the ceremony and the specific beliefs behind it are entirely modern inventions. They are using the space the way it was designed to be used. They are experiencing something of what the space was designed to produce. Whether this constitutes recovery of the tradition or merely improvisation in the presence of an ancient space is a question that different people will answer differently. What is not in question is that the stones still produce effects. They still organize the light at specific times of year in specific ways that feel significant. They still create acoustic environments that affect the people within them. They still locate their visitors in a relationship with the landscape and the sky that is different from the relationship available in the surrounding moorland. They still make it feel possible to those who are attentive enough and patient enough that something is happening in these places that goes beyond the purely physical. This is the reason that the standing stones of Scotland continue to draw visitors, continue to inspire scholarship, continue to generate the kind of sustained attention that most ancient monuments do not receive, not because they are the most impressive physical monuments. The pyramids are more impressive, Stonehenge is more famous. The stone temples of Malta are more architecturally sophisticated, but the Scottish standing stones have a quality of presence, of continued vitality, of still being, in some meaningful sense, alive and active. That is unusual among ancient monuments, and that is not entirely explained by the beauty of their settings or the precision of their astronomical alignments. They are alive because they were built to be alive, because the tradition they embody was not a tradition of building dead monuments to be admired from the outside, but of creating living spaces that worked from the inside, that did something when they were used, that produced effects that mattered to the people who used them. And whatever it was they produced, it has not entirely dissipated in 5,000 years of abandonment and rediscovery, and tourist visits and scholarly surveys. Something remains. The stones are still speaking in the only language they have, the language of stone positioned in relation to sky, of alignment encoding knowledge, of presence persisting through time. They are saying, still, what they have always been saying: the moon will return to this point in 18.6 years. The sun will rise here at midsummer. The dead are with us in the center of the circle. The knowledge is worth keeping. We were here. We paid attention. We built in stone so that you would know it. And we know it, imperfectly, incompletely, through the fog of 5,000 years, and the peat, and the forgetting, and the long distance between our world and theirs. But we know it. The stones made sure of that. There is a set of questions that the mainstream literature on Scottish megalithic monuments tends to approach carefully, deferring its answers, hedging its claims, presenting evidence, and then retreating slightly from the implications of that evidence. These are the questions about what the experience of the monuments was actually like, not from outside, not from the perspective of the archaeologist with a measuring tape, but from inside, from the perspective of the communities who built and used these places over a period of more than 2,000 years. The deferral is understandable. Archaeology is a discipline of material evidence, and what a place felt like to the people who used it is not preserved in the soil the way pottery sherds or charred grain or fragments of cremated bone are preserved. But the deferral has costs. It has allowed the Scottish standing stones to be discussed almost exclusively in terms of what they were made of and when they were built and what celestial events they were aligned to, while the question of what it was like to be in them, what they did to the people who were in them, and what those people believed they were doing, has remained underexplored to a degree that distorts the overall picture. The distortion is subtle, but significant. It is the distortion that occurs when you describe a cathedral entirely in terms of its architectural dimensions and the dates of its construction, without mentioning that it was built for worship, that the people who built it and used it believed that what happened inside it was real and important and connected them to something that transcended the physical structure. a cathedral described only as an arrangement of stone in certain geometric relationships, with certain acoustic properties and certain patterns of light at certain times of day, would be accurately described but profoundly misunderstood. The Scottish standing stones have been subjected to something like this treatment for most of the history of their study, described in terms of their material and astronomical properties, without adequate attention to what the people who built them believed they were doing and why it mattered to them. What we know about what those people believed comes from several sources, none of them direct, and all of them requiring careful interpretation. The first source is the material evidence itself, the things buried at the sites, the way the monuments are arranged in relation to each other and to the landscape, the specific astronomical events they are oriented to. The material evidence tells us something about the practice, about what people did at these places and in what sequence, even if it cannot tell us directly what they believed. The second source is the comparative anthropology of other megalithic and megalithic adjacent traditions across the world, traditions that in some cases have been studied in ethnographic depth and that in many cases share structural features with the Scottish tradition that suggest common underlying logics. The third source is the surviving fragments of the oral traditions that descended from the culture that built the monuments, including the medieval Celtic literature of Ireland and Scotland and the folk traditions that persisted into the modern period. None of these sources is unproblematic. The material evidence is fragmentary and subject to multiple interpretations. The comparative anthropology risks the imposition of patterns from one culture onto another that may not actually share the same underlying logic. And the oral traditions have been so thoroughly transformed by the passage of time and the successive layers of reinterpretation that identifying genuine continuities with the Neolithic is an enterprise requiring considerable scholarly caution. But used together, with appropriate awareness of their limitations, these three sources can produce a picture of what the Scottish megalithic tradition was about that is considerably richer than the purely astronomical or purely archaeological accounts that dominate the literature. The picture that emerges, tentatively and with appropriate hedging, is of a tradition organized around a set of relationships that the builders understood to be real and significant. The relationship between the living and the dead, the relationship between the human community and the celestial forces that governed the conditions of life, the relationship between individual members of the community and the larger social and cosmic order to which they belonged, and the relationship between the human beings who built and used the monuments and the landscape itself, the specific particular landscape of Scotland, with its specific quality of light and its specific patterns of weather and its specific astronomical events, that at this latitude and in this terrain took specific and sometimes extraordinary forms. These relationships were not abstract. They were not philosophical positions held at a theoretical distance from everyday experience. They were the framework within which everyday experience was organized and understood. When a community at Callanish or at one of the Aberdeenshire recumbent stone circles gathered to witness the moon at its major standstill, they were not doing astronomy in the sense that we do astronomy. They were participating in a relationship. They were present at the moment when the moon was most fully itself, most fully expressive of whatever quality or power or personality the moon represented in their understanding of the world, and their presence at that moment in the place that had been built specifically to be the right place to be at that moment was not passive observation. It was participation. It was action in the most meaningful sense of that word, action that they believed had effects in the world. What effects? This is where the evidence thins and the speculation necessarily increases. But certain things can be said. Many of the world's traditions of astronomical monument building and celestial ceremony are organized around the idea that the correct performance of ceremony at the correct moment and in the correct place ensures the continuation of the natural order that the ceremony celebrates. The winter solstice ceremony, in this logic, is not merely a celebration of the solstice. It is a participation in the process by which the sun turns and begins its return northward. The ceremony and the celestial event are understood to be in relationship with each other. the ceremony supporting or enabling or honoring the event validating the ceremony, and the belief system that underlies it. Whether this is true in any causal sense is a question that lies outside the domain of archaeology. But the belief that it is true is powerful and has been present in human cultures across a remarkable geographic and temporal range. If the builders of the Scottish megalithic monuments held this kind of belief about the ceremonies performed within the circles, then the circles were not merely observation platforms. They were instruments of participation in the cosmic order, places where the human community inserted itself into the processes that govern the world by performing at the right time and in the right place the ceremonies that their tradition required. And the precision of the astronomical alignments is, on this reading, not an academic exercise in celestial mechanics, but a practical necessity. If the ceremony is to accomplish what it is supposed to accomplish, it must be performed at the right moment. And the right moment is defined by the position of the sun or moon or stars in the sky. Getting the alignment right is the difference between the ceremony working and the ceremony not working. This is why the builders invested the precision they did in the alignments, not because they were astronomers in the modern sense, pursuing knowledge for its own sake, but because they were practitioners of a tradition in which precision mattered practically, in which the difference between an alignment that was right and an alignment that was slightly off was not a matter of aesthetic satisfaction, but of whether the thing the ceremony was supposed to do was actually done. Understanding this changes how you look at the stones. The precision of the alignments ceases to be merely impressive and becomes something more urgent, the mark of a tradition in which precision was life or death, in which getting it wrong was not a minor failure, but a catastrophic one, in which generations of patient observation and careful construction and sustained transmission of technical knowledge were not ends in themselves, but means to an end that the people involved understood to be of the most fundamental importance. They were trying to keep the world going. Not metaphorically, they were performing the ceremonies that they believed kept the sun turning, and the moon returning, and the seasons cycling, and the crops growing, and the community continuing. Every stone precisely placed was a piece of that project. Every alignment verified across the 18.6-year lunar cycle was a confirmation that the project was on track. Every community gathered within the circle at the right moment was the project happening, the participation in the cosmic order that the tradition required. This is what the archaeological evidence, taken as a whole, suggests, and it is a picture that makes the investment of labor and knowledge and sustained communal effort over more than 2,000 years entirely comprehensible. You do not spend 2,000 years building and maintaining and using these monuments because you enjoy astronomy or because you like building things in stone. You do it because you believe, with the conviction of a tradition that has been sustaining your community for longer than any living member can remember, that it is the most important thing your community does. There is a related set of questions about the dead that the monuments so consistently incorporate, and these too have been somewhat underexplored in the mainstream literature. The presence of human remains, cremated or inhumed, at or within many Scottish megalithic monuments is well documented. The dead at these sites are not simply buried near the monuments because the monuments happen to be significant landmarks in the landscape. The relationship is more intimate than that. At many sites, the dead are inside the circle, at its center, at the point of maximum astronomical significance. At the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire, the cremated remains of the dead are placed within the ring cairn that occupies the interior of the circle. At Callanish, deposits of human bone were found at the base of the central monolith, the tallest stone, the axis of the whole complex. At the great passage grave of Maes Howe on Orkney, which is not strictly speaking a standing stone monument, but which belongs to the same broad tradition and the same chronological period, the interior chamber is precisely aligned to receive the light of the setting midwinter sun, flooding the chamber with light that would have illuminated the bones of the dead interred there. The dead are in the light. The dead are at the center of the astronomical alignment. The dead are inside the instrument. This arrangement was deliberate. It tells us something about how the builders understood the relationship between the dead and the celestial cycles to which the monuments were oriented. The most coherent interpretation, consistent with the comparative anthropological evidence and with the structural logic of the monuments themselves, is that the dead were understood to be in a special relationship with the forces that the celestial cycles represented, a relationship that the living could not have directly, but that the dead, having crossed whatever boundary the builders believed separated the living from the other powers of the world, had entered. The dead inside the aligned monument were not simply commemorated. They were placed at the intersection of the human and the celestial, at the point where the community's closest mediators with the forces of the world resided. The community gathered in the circle was not just gathering with each other, it was gathering with its dead, the dead who were inside the circle, in the light at the axis, and the ceremony that was performed was addressed not only to the celestial forces represented by the alignment, but to the dead, through whom the community believed it could reach those forces. This is a complete cosmological system. It is not sophisticated by the standards of the great literate philosophical traditions of later antiquity, not elaborated into the kinds of texts that allow us to reconstruct doctrines and debates and internal disagreements. But it is sophisticated in the sense of being coherent, complete, and deeply integrated into the practical life of the communities that held it. The astronomical observation that allowed the alignments to be built, the labor that erected the stones, the transmission of technical and ceremonial knowledge across generations, the placement of the dead at the center of the instrument. All of these are elements of a single system, each supporting and requiring the others, and the system was maintained for more than 2,000 years. That is an extraordinary achievement of cultural continuity. The tradition of the Scottish megalithic monuments persisted through the entire Neolithic period and well into the Bronze Age, through climatic fluctuations and population changes, and the introduction of new technologies, through the gradual incorporation of the monument-building communities into a wider cultural world that brought new materials and new practices and new connections to distant peoples. The system was not fragile. It was deeply embedded in the culture that maintained it, integrated into the most fundamental beliefs and practices of the communities involved, resistant to the forces of change that were affecting every other aspect of their lives. What eventually disrupted it was not a rival belief system, or a foreign conquest, or a philosophical revolution. It was the climate, the 3.2 kiloyear event that brought cooler, wetter conditions to northwestern Europe, beginning around 1200 BCE, combined with the accumulated effects of 2,000 years of landscape degradation, created conditions that the communities of the Scottish megalithic tradition could not sustain. The communities contracted. The social surpluses that had supported the specialist knowledge and the communal labor of monument building disappeared. The most marginal settlements were abandoned, and the tradition, which required a minimum level of social organization and material surplus to sustain itself, began to fail. It failed gradually, not all at once. Some monuments continued to be used for burial, and probably for some forms of ceremony, long after the main phase of construction ended. Some elements of the tradition were preserved in the oral culture of the communities that survived the crisis. Some knowledge was carried forward in forms that were not immediately recognizable as connected to the monuments. But the public, organized, materially demanding tradition of building and maintaining and using the great aligned monuments at communal scale came to an end in Scotland around 1500 BCE and did not resume. What the tradition left behind, apart from the stones themselves, was a landscape that had been so thoroughly marked and modified by its presence that the marking could not be entirely forgotten, even after the tradition that produced it had ended. The stones were everywhere. They were in the fields where people farmed. They were on the hills where people grazed their animals. They were at the crossing points of rivers and at the heights of passes and at the edges of lochs. They were in every part of the landscape that had mattered to the people who built them. And the landscape of Scotland is not so large that the stones could be ignored or overlooked, or simply not noticed by the populations who came after. The stones were always there, always visible, always demanding explanation. And the explanations that the later populations generated, and however far from the original meaning they may have been, kept the stones present in the culture, kept them attached to significance, even when the original significance had been lost. This persistence in the cultural imagination is itself a remarkable thing. Many ancient monuments in other parts of the world fell into genuine obscurity, ceased to be culturally significant, came to be regarded simply as features of the landscape with no particular meaning attached to them. The Scottish standing stones never reached that condition. They were always meaningful, always attached to stories and prohibitions and folk practices, always more than just old rocks. The meaning shifted from the cosmological system of the builders to the Christian overlay of the medieval period to the romantic and archaeological interest of the modern era. But the meaningfulness never disappeared. This persistence suggests that whatever the stones did, whatever quality they had, whatever effect they produced in the people who encountered them, was not dependent entirely on the specific beliefs of the builders. Something about the stones themselves, about their physical presence in the landscape, about the specific quality of being in these places and experiencing the light and the sound and the relationship between the vertical mass of the stone and the horizontal sweep of the sky above it, retained a power that outlasted the tradition that had deliberately created that power. The stones were built to be powerful. They remained powerful after the context that had given them their specific meaning was gone. Whatever kind of power this is, it is real in the sense that it has effects on real people across a very wide range of cultural contexts. And it is not entirely understood. The understanding we have is growing. Archaeoacoustics, the study of the acoustic properties of ancient monuments, has revealed that the stone circles are sophisticated acoustic environments whose properties appear to have been deliberately designed. Landscape archaeology has revealed that the monuments are positioned in the landscape with a care and intentionality that goes far beyond what is needed for purely local function. Astronomical archaeology has documented the precision of the alignments with sufficient rigor that the deliberateness of those alignments is now beyond serious doubt. Ancient DNA and isotope analysis are revealing the human dimension of the tradition. The people who moved between sites, the communities that contributed labor and animals to the great ceremonial centers, the genetic and dietary patterns that trace the social networks within which the tradition operated. All of this is enriching the picture. And the picture that is emerging, as the various strands of research are slowly integrated, is of a tradition that was considerably more sophisticated, more coordinated, more deliberately constructed, and more deeply meaningful to the communities that maintained it than the early accounts allowed. The builders of the Scottish standing stones were not simple farmers performing agricultural magic with piles of rocks. They were participants in a tradition of knowledge and practice that had been developing for thousands of years, that engaged with some of the most fundamental questions of human existence, that produced monuments of genuine technical and aesthetic sophistication, and that for more than 2,000 years was one of the most important things that the people of Scotland did. They did it in stone, in the hardest and most permanent material available to them, in the landscape where the conditions that motivated it were most acute, and the tradition that drove it was most deeply rooted. And the result is still there, still aligned, still waiting for whoever comes with enough patience and enough curiosity and enough willingness to sit with difficult questions long enough to begin to hear the answers. The specific stories of specific stones deserve more time than the scope of this telling allows, but a few deserve to be named because they illuminate aspects of the tradition that the major ceremonial sites, for all their documented complexity, do not reveal. The Mashrie moorstones on the Isle of Arran are 6 stone circles arranged across a stretch of moorland in the southwest of the island, each different from the others in size and material and degree of preservation, each representing a different moment in a long sequence of construction that stretched from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. Some of the circles are built from the red sandstone that underlies the moor, rough-textured and warm-coloured, conspicuous in the landscape. Others use granite erratics, boulders left behind by the retreating glaciers, incorporated into human monuments in a way that blurs the boundary between the natural and the constructed, between what the glacier left and what the builders added. One circle, Machrie Moor Seswar, consists of only 3 surviving stones, one of which stands more than 5 meters tall, by far the tallest megalith in the west of Scotland, a single enormous finger of sandstone that can be seen from miles away and that has no obvious relationship to any other monument in terms of its scale. Why is that stone so tall? There are various answers in the literature, mostly variations on the idea that height signifies importance, that the tallest stone marks the most significant direction or the most important alignment. But there is another possibility that is less often discussed, which is that the stone is tall because it needed to be seen from a particular distance. If you know where you need to see the stone from, and you know what the stone needs to be visible above in the landscape, between that point and the stone's location, you build the stone tall enough to be visible above it. The stone is a marker visible at a specific distance in a specific direction for a specific purpose that we no longer know. Or consider the nether larger standing stones in Kilmartin Glen, which is itself one of the most concentrated and most remarkable prehistoric landscapes in Scotland. A long valley in Argyll that contains within a few square kilometres a linear cemetery of burial cairns, several standing stones, rock carvings, and the remains of a stone circle that is among the oldest in Scotland. The linear cemetery, 5 cairns arranged in a line, running approximately north to south across the valley floor, was constructed over a period of several centuries during the Neolithic and Early Bronze Age, each cairn marking the burial of significant members of the community, and together creating a monumental landscape of the dead that organized the living community's relationship to its valley. The standing stones at Netherlargy are positioned in relation to this cairn cemetery in ways that appear deliberate. 2 of them, the Netherlargy standing stones proper, are positioned to frame a specific astronomical alignment, the midsummer moonrise, in a way that connects them to the lunar tradition, documented at other Scottish sites. But their position relative to the cairn cemetery also creates a visual relationship between the living ceremonial space at the stones and the dead in the cairns, a relationship that makes the whole valley into a landscape where the astronomical and the funerary are integrated in much the same way we saw at the Aberdeenshire recumbent stone circles. Kilmartin Glen as a whole is a landscape of relationship, of deliberate connections drawn between different kinds of monument, different moments in time, different aspects of the human engagement with the landscape. The cairns and the standing stones and the rock carvings, many of which show abstract geometric patterns and cup marks that are also found at megalithic sites elsewhere in Scotland and in Ireland and in Brittany, are elements of a single complex expression of a community's relationship with its valley and with the sky above it, and with the dead who are woven into the landscape alongside the living. The cup marks and abstract carvings that appear both in Kilmartin Glen and at many other Scottish megalithic sites deserve attention because they are one of the most widespread and least understood elements of the whole tradition. They appear on the surfaces of standing stones, on the flat rock faces of outcrops near megalithic monuments, on the capping stones of burial cairns, and occasionally on the interior surfaces of passage graves and chamber tombs. They range from simple cup-shaped depressions ground into the rock surface to complex compositions of cups arranged in patterns, cups surrounded by rings, cup and ring marks, which are among the most widespread form, consisting of a central cup depression surrounded by one or more concentric circles. The cup and ring mark tradition is found across a vast geographic area, from Scotland and Ireland through Britain and across into continental Europe and beyond. The consistency of the basic motif across this area suggests that it was a shared tradition rather than an independent invention in multiple locations. But what it meant, what the motifs signified, what practice they were associated with, is almost entirely unknown. The marks are clearly symbolic. They were clearly made deliberately and with care, often requiring significant effort to produce in the hard rock surfaces on which they appear. They appear in locations associated with other forms of megalithic activity, suggesting that they were part of the same broad tradition of practice. The most common interpretation is that they were connected to ceremonies associated with water and light, that the cup depression was used to hold water, that the patterns of light reflected from water in the cups at specific times of day or at specific times of year, had ceremonial significance. There is some support for this in the positioning of many cup mark sites, which tends to be on horizontal or near horizontal surfaces, where water would accumulate in the cup depressions, and in the frequency with which cup mark sites are located, where specific patterns of light would have fallen on them at significant times of year. But this remains a hypothesis rather than an established interpretation. What the cup marks most clearly tell us, in the absence of a fully satisfying interpretation of their meaning, is that the tradition of marking the landscape with deliberate symbols was not confined to the large standing stone monuments, but extended into a much wider range of sites and surfaces, creating a symbolic landscape that was far denser and more pervasive than the standing stones alone suggest. The whole landscape of Scotland, in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, was marked, was spoken to, was engaged with in symbolic terms. The standing stones are the most dramatic and most durable form of that engagement, but they are part of something much larger, a total relationship between a people and their landscape that expressed itself in every form of permanent mark they could make, from the great astronomical monuments down to the small cup-shaped depression ground patiently into a rock by a hillside stream. This total relationship is what Scotland lost when the tradition ended. Not just the stone circles, not just the astronomical knowledge, not just the ceremonies and the oral traditions and the specialist knowledge that connected the communities across the landscape. The total engagement with the landscape as a meaningful place, as a place alive with significance at every level, from the great astronomical events that could only be perceived at the scale of a monument to the small cups in the rock that accumulated water and caught the light. The landscape of Scotland today still carries the traces of that total engagement, not just in the standing stones that are formally recognised as monuments, but in the countless small rock carvings that are scattered across hillsides and outcrops, many of them not on any monument register, many of them known only to the farmers whose land they occupy. Walk carefully across the landscape of Argyll or Perthshire, and you will encounter marks on rock surfaces that were made by people 4,000 or 5,000 years ago and that have never been recorded, never been studied, that exist only in the landscape itself, doing quietly whatever it is they have been doing for 4,000 years. These marks are not dark in the sinister sense. They are dark in the sense of being hidden, of being in the darkness of the unknown, of being present but unread. Like the stones themselves, they are waiting for a reading that has not yet been fully accomplished, that may not be fully accomplishable with the tools and the knowledge we currently have. They are patient. They have been patient for millennia. They will continue to be patient for as long as the stone endures, and the marks in it survive the weather and the moss and the occasional, well-intentioned power washer of ancient rock art. The patience of the stones is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about them. Human beings are impatient. We want answers quickly, want understanding to arrive in forms we can process and communicate and move on from. The stones offer none of this. They stand in the same place they have always stood, answering no questions, demanding nothing, simply being what they have always been, which is what was built, what was aligned, what was positioned precisely in relation to the sky and the landscape and the other stones, by people who knew what they were doing and did it with care and did not survive to explain themselves. The patience of the stones is an invitation of a kind, though not one that is as easy to accept in the modern world. It is an invitation to slowness, to extended attention, to the kind of watching that the builders of the monuments practiced, the watching that takes place over years and generations, rather than in the time it takes to drive to a heritage site and take a photograph. The stones were built by watchers. They can only be read by watchers. And in a world that moves as fast as ours moves, in a world full of the noise and distraction that the builders of the stones could not have imagined, the watching that the stones require is itself a kind of discipline, a practice that the stones teach simply by being what they are and requiring what they require. This is part of why Scotland is the country it is. Not only because of the castles and the clans and the whisky and the mountains, all of which are real and significant parts of the Scottish character, but because underlying all of that, older than all of that, is a landscape that was intensely marked and intensely engaged with by people who paid attention to it, with a depth and a persistence that left traces everywhere, in the great ceremonial monuments and in the small marks on rock by hillside streams, in the alignments of stones to the movements of the moon, and in the folk traditions that remembered, however dimly, that the stones were powerful and the night sky was important, and the old ways of watching deserved preservation. Scotland is a country haunted by the depth of its own history, by the sense that what lies beneath the surface of the recorded past is older and stranger and more complex than anything the recorded past can account for. The standing stones are the most visible expression of that haunting, the most tangible proof that the landscape was once inhabited by people who understood it in ways that have not been fully recovered, and who left the traces of their understanding everywhere you look, if you know how to look. They are there in the morning light on the Lewis moorland, the great stones of Callanish catching the first light from the east and casting long shadows across the peat. They are there in the summer dusk on Orkney, the Ring of Brodgar silhouetted against a sky that barely darkens even at midnight. They are there in the quiet field on Islay, where the unnamed stone stands as it has always stood, doing what it has always done, in a silence that 5,000 years have not broken. They are Scotland's deepest voice, the voice of a people who no longer exist, speaking in the only language they left behind. And the reason there are so many of them, more than anywhere else in Europe, is that the people who built them had more to say, and said it with more urgency, and needed it to last longer than any other people who have ever built with stone. The sky they aligned their monuments to is the same sky you see tonight, if you step outside and look up. The moon that walked through the southern avenue at Callanish at its major standstill is the same moon that is somewhere above you, now in its own stage of the same 18.6-year cycle. The connection is real. It is not metaphorical. The stones were aligned to something that is still there, to patterns that still hold, to a sky that has not changed except in the positions of the stones' shadows on the ground. And if the stones were aligned to what still exists, then they are still aligned. The connection between the monument and the celestial event is still intact, even if no one is gathered within the circle to witness it. The stones are still doing what they were built to do, still oriented to the sky in the way their builders oriented them, still waiting for the moon to return to the angle at which it walks the southern avenue and descends behind the hill. They do not need us to do this. They are doing it with or without us, have been doing it since the builders placed them. We'll continue doing it long after we are gone. But they were built by people who wanted the alignment to be witnessed, who built the avenue specifically so that it could be filled with witnesses when the moon made its most dramatic appearance. The stones are still waiting for the witnesses. That is the invitation. That is what the standing stones of Scotland offer, in their dark patience, their ancient silence, their persistent alignment to a sky that has not changed. They offer the possibility of witnessing something that human beings first witnessed more than 5,000 years ago and built monuments to remember and return to. The thing itself is still there. The moon still walks. The stones still stand in its path. The alignment is still true. You only have to go there at the right moment and look. There is something that gets overlooked in almost every account of the Scottish standing stones, something so basic that its absence from the standard narrative is itself a kind of clue to the blind spots in how we have approached these monuments. The thing that gets overlooked is the labour, not as an abstract quantity, not as a statistic about how many person-hours it took to erect a given stone, but as a lived experience, as the actual physical reality of what it meant for a Neolithic community to move a stone weighing several tons across a landscape, with no roads, no vehicles, no draft animals capable of the task, nothing except human bodies and human ingenuity and whatever tools could be improvised from wood and rope and antler. The labour of building a standing stone monument was not a background fact. It was a foreground reality for everyone involved, a central experience of the project that would have shaped how the community related to the monument they were building. When you have spent weeks of your life moving a single stone, when you have organised the entire community around the task, when you have watched people you know exhaust themselves in service of the goal, the stone that finally stands in the earth is not an abstract symbol or an astronomical instrument. It is the product of specific people's specific effort, of specific conversations and specific arguments, and specific moments of discouragement and specific moments of triumph. It is saturated with the experience of having been moved by human hands. This saturation is part of what makes the stones powerful, not in a mystical sense necessarily, but in the practical sense that things which have cost a community a great deal tend to be invested with a proportionate degree of significance, tend to be protected and maintained and used and returned to in ways that things which cost nothing are not. The labor of building the monument was also the labor of building the monument's importance in the community's life. The stones were important in part simply because so much had been invested in them. How exactly the stones were moved and erected remains a matter of active research. The basic mechanics are understood reasonably well. Stones were dragged on sledges or rollers, often along routes especially prepared for the purpose, sometimes along frozen ground in winter when the friction was reduced. They were raised using combinations of ramps and levers and ropes, techniques that require no sophisticated tools, but do require considerable knowledge of engineering principles and considerable coordination of the workforce. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that all of this is achievable with Neolithic technology and sufficient human labor. But the specifics of how particular stones were moved from their quarry sites to their final positions tell individual stories that are worth knowing. The stones of Callanish are Lewisian gneiss, the same material as the bedrock of the Lewis moorland on which the circle stands. This means the builders did not need to transport the stones from distant quarries. The raw material was available in the landscape itself, in the outcrops of gneiss that protrude from the moorland at various points across the island. The builders selected specific stones, probably stones that had already been shaped by natural fracturing into something close to the form needed, and moved them to the site, which in some cases meant moving them only a few hundred meters, and in others, perhaps a kilometer or more. The selection process itself reflects a sophisticated understanding of the material. Not all Lewisian gneiss is the same. The different compositions and crystal structures of different rock types affect how they weather, how they fracture, how they stand under the loads imposed by their own weight in the earth. The builders selected stones that would stand well, that would not fracture under the lateral pressure of the earth packed around their bases, that would weather in ways that maintained their essential form rather than degrading it. This required knowledge of the rock that could only come from long familiarity with the local geology, from generations of working with the stone in other contexts before it was used for the great monuments. The same is true, in different ways, for the builders of monuments in other parts of Scotland. The recumbent stones of Aberdeenshire were selected not just for their size, but for their specific geological properties. Many of them showed distinctive banding or coloration that would have made them visually striking in the landscape, that would have caught the light in specific ways, that would have been recognizable from significant distances. The selection of visually distinctive stones for the most prominent positions in the monument reflects an aesthetic sensibility and an attention to the visual qualities of the material that goes well beyond what purely functional monument building would require. This aesthetic sensibility is one of the things that most clearly marks the builders of the Scottish megalithic monuments as fully human in the richest sense of the word. They were not simply solving practical problems, not simply building functional instruments for astronomical observation or boundary marking or the commemoration of the dead. They were making things they found beautiful, making things that pleased them in the looking, making things that expressed something about how they saw the world and their place in it that went beyond the strictly necessary. The beauty they were making was not the polished, finished beauty of sculpture or the decorative beauty of the carved designs that sometimes appear on megalithic monuments in Ireland and Brittany. It was a rougher, more austere beauty, the beauty of large stones in open landscape, of simple forms against complex sky, of the relationship between the vertical and the horizontal that a standing stone makes in the flat moorland. This is a beauty that requires an eye tuned to landscape rather than to interior decoration, an eye that has spent a great deal of time watching a specific landscape and knows what works in it, what is in proportion with it, what is powerful in relation to it. The Scottish landscape is itself a teacher of this kind of beauty. The clarity of the light, the scale of the hills, the way the sky fills more of the visual field than it does in more sheltered, more wooded landscapes. All of this trains the eye toward a particular aesthetic that is different from the aesthetic of places where nature is softer and more domesticated. The builders of the Scottish standing stones had been trained by their landscape, and the monuments they built are its students' work, reflecting back the landscape's own aesthetic in the materials the landscape provided. This is another reason why the stones feel right where they are, feel like they belong to the landscape. They are made of the same material as the ground they stand in. They grew from that ground, in a geological sense, and they were returned to it in a cultural sense, placed back in the landscape by the people who knew it best, positioned according to a knowledge of the landscape that was inseparable from a knowledge of the sky above it. The sky and the land are not separate in the Scottish megalithic tradition. They are aspects of a single thing, a single environment that the people inhabiting it knew with the intimacy of long familiarity, and that the monuments were built to make legible in the terms that the culture understood. The sky and the land spoke to each other through the stones. The movements of the moon and the positions of the stones were aspects of a single conversation, a conversation that had been going on for thousands of years before the stones were built, and that the stones were built to join, to participate in, to make audible to the community that gathered within them. This is the sense in which the stones are not separate from the landscape but are part of it. They are not foreign objects placed in a natural setting. They are the landscape thinking about itself, the landscape's own material rearranged by the people who inhabited it to make visible the patterns that the landscape itself expressed only in ways too large or too slow to be seen directly. The 18.6-year cycle of the lunar standstill is a feature of the relationship between the Earth and the Moon. The Scottish moorland at the latitude of Callanish is the place where that feature is expressed most dramatically in terms of the visual spectacle of the Moon walking along the horizon. The builders of Callanish did not invent this relationship. They made it visible, made it accessible to human experience, built a frame around it that allowed it to be witnessed as the extraordinary thing it is. They were, in this sense, interpreters of the landscape, interpreters of the sky, interpreters of the relationship between the two. And the stones are their interpretation, permanent and precise and patient, waiting for us to understand what they were pointing at and why it mattered so much to point at it in stone. What they were pointing at is still there. The relationship between the Earth and the Moon has not changed. The visual drama of the major lunar standstill at the latitude of Lewis has not diminished. The clear northern sky, when it is clear, which it is not always, but is often enough, still shows the stars with the same intensity that the builders of the monuments watched under on the long winter nights, when the tradition of skywatching was deepest and most productive. The raw material of what the monuments encode is still present in the world, still available to anyone who takes the trouble to go to the right place at the right time and look. This availability is not trivial. In a world where most of what the past left us is inaccessible, where the languages are dead and the traditions are gone, and the specific qualities of experience that were possible in the ancient world are not reproducible in the modern one, the fact that the astronomical events the standing stones were built to frame are still occurring on the same schedule they always have is remarkable. The past that the stones embody is not entirely past. Part of it is still happening, still real, still occurring on schedule, as reliable as it has ever been. And the stones themselves are still there, having outlasted everything that time could throw at them except time itself. They have survived the peat and the weather and the gradual forgetting and the centuries of being explained as the work of giants or the sites of dark ceremonies. They have survived the scholarly debates and the tourist buses and all of the ways that a modern world has of absorbing ancient things into the routine of heritage management. They are still strange. They are still pointing at something. They are still aligned. The full account of what the Scottish standing stones are and what they were built for is a story that cannot be told in any single telling, that sits at the intersection of astronomy and archaeology and climate science and anthropology and mythology, and the simple, stubborn fact of standing stones in a landscape that has changed around them for 5,000 years, while they have not changed at all. This telling has been one approach, one path through the material. There are other paths. The stones are large enough to sustain many different approaches, patient enough to be revisited from many different angles, complex enough that no single account exhausts them. What this account has tried to do is take seriously the darkness of the stones, not the romantic darkness of mystery for its own sake, not the sensational darkness of theories about ancient aliens or lost civilizations or sacrificial practices, but the genuine, earned darkness that comes from 5,000 years of forgetting, from the gap between what the builders knew and what we can recover, from the awareness that something extraordinary happened in the Scottish landscape over a period of 2,000 years, and that we are still in the early stages of understanding what it was. That darkness is not a failure of archaeology or of scholarship. It is the natural condition of the relationship between the present and a past that predates writing. Writing is how we remember things across large spans of time. Without it, we are dependent on the archaeological record, which preserves what the earth preserves and nothing else, and on the stones themselves, which preserve what stone preserves, which is the form but not the meaning, the alignment but not the ceremony, the fact of the building but not the experience of being in it when it was being used. The darkness is also, in a strange way, a gift. It is the space in which curiosity survives. A past fully explained, fully recovered, fully transparent to the present would be a past that had nothing left to offer, no further depth to explore, no further questions to sit with. The Scottish standing stones are a gift of inexhaustibility. No matter how much we learn about them, there is always more. No matter how precisely we measure the alignments, there is always another alignment to consider. No matter how thoroughly we reconstruct the social and environmental context of their construction, there is always another dimension that the reconstruction does not fully capture. They will still be there and still be offering this inexhaustibility when everyone who has ever written about them, or thought about them, or visited them has been gone for centuries, and they will still be aligned, and the moon will still walk through the southern avenue at Callanish and descend behind the hill, as it did last time and the time before that, and every 18.6 years back to the beginning, to the moment when the builders placed the last stone of the last avenue and stepped back and saw that it was done, that the monument was complete, that the alignment was true. They could not have imagined us, but they built for us anyway, built in the most permanent material available, built with a precision that would outlast any possible forgetting, built to be found and read and wondered at by whoever came after them, however long after, however changed the world around the stones. They built with faith that what they were doing was worth doing, even knowing that the doing of it would not be complete in their lifetimes, that the tradition would have to be maintained across generations they would never live to see, that the monument would be used by people who were not yet born, and then by people who had forgotten what the monuments were for, and then perhaps by people who had learned again to read them. We are perhaps beginning to be those people. We are perhaps in the early stages of the reading that the builders always knew would eventually happen, because they built in a way that made it inevitable. The alignment is too precise to be missed forever. The astronomy is too real to remain unnoticed indefinitely. The stones are too patient to give up. They have not given up. They are standing. And somewhere above you, right now, whether you can see it through clouds or city lights or the roof of whatever shelter you are in, the moon is in its arc, tracing the same path it traced when the builders of Callanish watched it and knew that what they were watching was worth building toward. The pattern is real. The connection is real. The stones are still saying what they have always been saying. In the dark, under the same sky, the stones stand. That is enough. That has always been enough. That is why there are so many of them. There is a word in Scottish Gaelic, samchair, that means something closer to tranquil stillness than any single English word manages, a quality of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a particular kind of quietness, the quietness of a place that has been still for a long time, and that carries that stillness as something palpable, something you can feel on your skin. The word is used to describe remote landscapes, particularly the landscapes of the islands and the highlands, but it is also used to describe what you find in certain places that are marked by human presence, places where something human has happened and then receded, leaving the place quieter than it would be if nothing had ever happened there. The standing stones have Sam chair. It is the most consistent thing reported by people who spend extended time in these places, the thing that persists after the intellectual engagement with the astronomy and the archaeology, after the photographs and the measurements and the scholarly notes, after all of that has receded. The stillness remains. It is not the stillness of a place where nothing has ever happened, but the stillness of a place where a great deal has happened, where the happening has been absorbed into the stone and the ground and the air around the stone, and where the accumulated weight of everything that has happened there over thousands of years rests quietly in the present moment. This is not a mystical claim, or rather, it is a mystical claim, only if you define mysticism as the recognition that certain places carry qualities that are not explicable purely in terms of their physical properties. Stone does not have memory in any physical sense that chemistry can describe. The Lewisian gneiss of Callanish does not contain, in its crystal structure, the experiences of the thousands of people who have stood within the circle over the last 5,000 years. And yet, something persists there that is different from what persists in unworked rock on the hillside nearby. The difference is in what the stones have been made into, in what their arrangement means and has always meant, in the fact that they are still doing what they were built to do, even in the absence of anyone who understands fully what that is. The stillness of the standing stones is the stillness of purpose fulfilled quietly over an inconceivably long time. The stones were built to last. They have lasted. The astronomical alignments were built to be accurate. They are accurate. The connection between the monument and the sky was built to be permanent. It is permanent. Everything that was built to persist has persisted. Only the understanding has not kept pace with the persistence. And the gap between what the stones know and what we know about them is the space in which the Samchair lives. We began this telling with a question. Why Scotland? Why this cold and difficult country at the northwestern edge of Europe has more standing stones per square mile than any other country on the continent, more than France with its great Breton monument complexes, more than Ireland with its spectacular passage graves and stone circles, more than England with its famous Avebury and Stonehenge. The question seemed at first like it might have a simple answer, some combination of geology and geography and population density that would explain the numbers without requiring any deeper investigation. The answer is not simple. It is not the kind of answer that fits comfortably in a sentence or a paragraph. It is the kind of answer that requires traveling through 5,000 years of climate history, through the complexity of the astronomical knowledge encoded in the alignments, through the sociology of specialist knowledge transmission in a society without writing, through the archaeology of crisis and response, and the terrible patience of communities watching their world change and doing the only thing they knew how to do, which was to build something that would outlast the change. The answer, in the end, is that Scotland has more standing stones than any other country in Europe, because the people who built them needed them more, maintained them longer, and invested in them more deeply than any other people who ever built with stone on this continent. They needed them because they lived at the edge of the viable world, where the margin between survival and failure was thinnest, and the urgency of maintaining the connection with the forces that governed that margin was most acute. They maintained them because the tradition of sky watching that the monuments embodied was older in Scotland than in the rest of Britain, rooted in a Mesolithic culture of astronomical observation that predated the coming of farming by thousands of years. And they invested in them because whatever they believed about the relationship between the stones and the sky and the forces that the sky represented, they believed it completely enough to build 5,000 monuments to that belief across a landscape that did not make building easy. And now the monuments stand, and we stand before them, and the gap between us and the people who built them is real and enormous, and in important ways unbridgeable. But it is not absolute. The sky they watched is our sky. The moon they aligned their monuments to is our moon. The patterns they encoded in stone are patterns we can measure and verify and understand to the degree that understanding them astronomically allows. The landscape they marked is the landscape we can walk in, and in walking in it we can feel, however dimly and however incompletely, something of what they felt in it, the quality of a place that has been attended to over a very long time by people who were paying attention as carefully as human beings can pay attention. There is a practice in some traditions of sitting with a difficult or profound thing rather than trying immediately to resolve it, to let the thing be what it is without forcing it into a form that is easier to process, but less true to the original. The standing stones of Scotland invite this kind of sitting. They resist easy resolution. They resist the kind of answer that closes the question and allows you to move on. They keep the question open, keep it alive, keep it pressing against the edge of what we know with the insistence of something that knows there is more to say and is prepared to wait for as long as it takes for someone to be ready to hear it. The 5,000 years they have already waited is not a long time, from the stone's point of view. They are made of rock that formed 3 billion years ago. They are patient in the way that only very old things can be patient. They will still be there when every person who has read about them, or thought about them, or visited them has been gone for centuries. They will still be oriented to the sky. The moon will still walk through the southern avenue at Callanish at the major standstill, even if there is no one left to see it. The alignment will hold. But there is still time, and there are still people, and the stones are still legible to those who approach them, with the combination of scientific rigor and patient attention that they require. The research is ongoing, the surveys are ongoing, the analysis of ancient DNA and isotope ratios and pollen cores is ongoing, gradually building a picture of the people who built the monuments and the world they lived in that is more detailed and more nuanced than anything that existed even a decade ago. The acoustic studies are ongoing. The statistical analysis of the long-range geometric relationships between sites is ongoing. We are still reading the stones. We are doing it with better tools than we have ever had, and the picture that is emerging from that reading is not simpler than we expected, but considerably more complex, more sophisticated, more deeply embedded in a world of astronomical knowledge and geographic awareness and spiritual practice than the conventional accounts of Neolithic Scotland have allowed. The builders were not simple farmers who erected a few stones between planting and harvest. They were the inheritors of a tradition of sky-watching that went back to the Mesolithic, participants in a network of cultural connection that spread across the full extent of the British Isles, specialists in forms of knowledge that we are only beginning to reconstruct. What they built in stone was the product of that knowledge, the materialization of a way of understanding the world that placed the human community in intimate relationship with the celestial forces that governed the world's conditions. When the climate turned against them, when the peat rose and the harvest shortened and the community contracted, they built more urgently, in more places, because the need for that relationship was most acute exactly when the conditions that allowed the tradition to be sustained were most threatened. And eventually the building stopped, and the peat rose, and the stones went under for a while, and when they came back into the light, they were in a different world, a world that no longer knew how to read them. We are trying to learn again. It is slow work, and it is incomplete, and it may never be fully accomplished. But the stones are patient, and the sky is still there, and the alignments are still true. And somewhere in the gap between what we know and what the stones know, there is still an extraordinary amount of the human story to be recovered. This is why the standing stones of Scotland are dark. Not because the people who built them were dark, though they lived in darkness, in the long northern winters and the firelit nights and the darkness of not knowing whether the sun would bring enough warmth to ripen the crops. Not because the purposes they built the stones for were dark, though they involved the dead and the mystery of what lies beyond the visible and the desperate prayer of a community at the edge of what the world could sustain. But because the knowledge they built into the stones is in the dark, for us, on our side of the 5,000-year gap, and the work of recovering it is slow and difficult and may never be complete. The darkness is in the distance. The darkness is in the forgetting. The darkness is in the peat that rises, metaphorically as well as literally, over everything that human beings build and believe and know, covering it slowly until only the stones remain, patient and aligned, and speaking in a language that takes centuries to learn to hear. But the stones are there. The sky is the same sky. And the night you step outside and look up at the moon, tracing its arc across the stars, and feel something that is not quite understanding, but is also not nothing. Something that is older than thought and more persistent than knowledge. Something that the builders of the stones also felt when they stood where you are standing and looked up at the same sky. That feeling is not an illusion. It is a recognition. The oldest recognition there is, which is that you are small and temporary, and the sky is vast and patient, and that the small and temporary thing is connected to the vast and patient thing in ways that the standing stones were built to mark and maintain and make permanent, and that across 5,000 years and every kind of forgetting that time can accomplish, the connection holds. The moon will be at its major lunar standstill again soon. The next one falls in 2025, the one after in 2043. At Callanish, if you stand in the Northern Avenue and look south at the right moment, you will see it happen as it has happened at every standstill since the stones were placed in position 5,000 years ago. The moon will rise from behind the hills to the southeast. It will appear to walk the Southern Avenue, stone by stone, in its low arc across the southern horizon. And then it will descend behind the hill to the south, as though returning to the earth, as though the earth were taking it back, as the builders of the avenue arranged for it to seem. They built this for you to see, not for you specifically, not knowing you would exist, but for whoever would be standing in the Northern Avenue at the moment of the major standstill, 5,000 years forward or 5,000 years beyond that, for whoever would be patient enough to be there, and attentive enough to look, and curious enough to have learned what they were looking at. They built it so that this moment would always be available, would always be accessible, would outlast every crisis and every forgetting and every wave of newcomers who did not understand the old tradition. They built well. The moment is still available. The avenue is still aligned. The moon will walk it again. You could be there. The stones of Scotland are not finished with us. They have been waiting 5,000 years, which is nothing, which is the blink of an eye, which is an amount of time that their builders would have had difficulty imagining. They will wait as long as they need to. And whatever it is they have been trying to tell us, whatever the full content of the message, encoded in their alignments and their geometry and their acoustic properties and their position in the landscape and their relationship to each other across the miles of Scottish moorland and coastline, it is still there, still waiting, still true. We are learning to hear it. We are learning slowly, with every year of careful research adding another piece to the picture, with every excavation and every isotope analysis and every carefully calculated astronomical alignment adding another word to the translation of a language that has been silent for 3,000 years. The translation is not complete. It may never be complete. But it is advancing, and what it is revealing is something that the people who built the stones would have recognized, we think, as a reasonable attempt to understand what they were doing and why they did it and what it cost them to do it in the world they were living in. They were paying attention to the sky. They were building monuments to hold what they noticed. They were maintaining a tradition that they knew, somehow, was worth more than the effort it cost to maintain. They were, in the face of a world that was genuinely difficult and sometimes genuinely terrifying, asserting that certain things were worth preserving, certain knowledge was worth encoding in the most permanent material available, certain relationships between the human community and the forces of the world deserved to be made visible and marked and returned to at the times when those forces were most powerfully expressed. And they were right. The knowledge was worth preserving. The relationships were worth marking. The sky and the earth and the human community that lives between them are still in the relationship that the stones were built to honor, even if most of us no longer know that the relationship exists, and even fewer of us know what the stones have to say about it. The dark reason Scotland has more standing stones than any country in Europe is that Scotland needed them more, believed in them more deeply, and built them with more urgency and more care and more skill than anywhere else. And that the need, the belief, and the care all arose from the same source, which was the particular character of the Scottish landscape, its difficulty, and its beauty, and its darkness, and its extraordinary sky, and the particular character of the people who inhabited it, who were paying attention to that sky long before anyone thought to build in stone, and who, when they did build, left something behind that is not quite finished with us yet. There is one more thing to say, and it is the simplest thing, the thing that is easiest to overlook when you are deep in astronomical alignments and climate data and archaeological debates. The standing stones are beautiful. Whatever else they are, whatever they meant, and whatever knowledge they encoded, and whatever crises they were built to address, they are beautiful. Not in the smooth, finished, immediately legible way of monuments that were built to be admired, but in the specific, complicated way that things are beautiful when they have been exactly what they were meant to be for a very long time, when the purpose and the form are perfectly matched, and the purpose has not changed in 5,000 years. They are beautiful the way the moon is beautiful, the way the aurora is beautiful, the way the light on the Lewis moorland is beautiful on a clear morning in June, when the sky has that particular quality of northern light that exists nowhere else in the world. They are beautiful because they belong to that landscape so completely that removing them would damage the landscape, the way removing a load-bearing wall damages a building. The landscape of Scotland and the stones of Scotland have grown around each other over 5,000 years, until they are, in some deep sense, the same thing. The stones are the landscape made intentional, the landscape expressing its relationship to the sky through the agency of the people who understood that relationship well enough to build it into stone. This is the last word that the stones have. Not the astronomy, not the geometry, not the acoustic properties, not the crisis response or the tradition of specialist knowledge or the 18.6-year cycle of the moon. The last word is simpler and earlier than all of those, and it is the word that was there before any of the others, the word from which all of the others grew. The word is attention. They paid attention. They paid more attention, for longer and in more places, than anyone else who ever inhabited a comparable landscape. And the stones are what paying that much attention looks like when you build it into the most permanent material available. Pay attention. It is what they were saying then, and it is what they are saying now. The sky is up there. The patterns are real. The connections are real. The knowledge is worth having and worth keeping. Pay attention. The standing stones of Scotland are still standing. The sky is still there. The moon is still making its 18.6-year journey through the same arc it has always travelled. And the stones are still aligned to it, patient and dark and beautiful, waiting for whoever is attentive enough to look. That is the dark reason, and it is also, in the end, the only reason that ever mattered. The darkness is ours, not theirs. Theirs was always the light. If something in this slow journey through the stones moved you or kept you company in the dark, tap like so the algorithm carries these stories to more people. Subscribe if you want more nights like this. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it is there. Someone in Orkney at midnight, someone in Edinburgh in the small hours, someone reading from a place the builders of Callanish never imagined, connected to them by nothing more than the same sky. If you want to support this work, there is a membership here on the channel. Completely optional. These stories will always be free. But if you find value in the slow, careful kind of telling that takes ancient things seriously, the membership helps make more of this possible. For now, you do not need to do anything at all. The stones are standing. The moon is somewhere in its arc. And you are here, in the dark, which is exactly where the builders of the stones did their best work. Let the stones stand and the knowledge rest in the alignment for another night. It has been resting there for 5,000 years. It is in no hurry. And neither are you. Rest.